Hello and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff. This week on the show, we are continuing our journey through the world of The Matrix with the 2003 sequel, The Matrix Reloaded, one of my favorite movie sequel titles of all time, if nothing else.
Yes. I had a revelation watching the movie yesterday where I've always only thought of the title of that movie in relationship to guns, and I never realized that also you load things on computers. And it is also a computer pun. And I was like,
never thought of that. Oh my.
Yeah, it's a computer thing also. It's just like I saw the title come up, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's also a computer thing.
Okay,
and my mind was blown.
Greatest movie sequel title of all time. Its only competition is like The Squeakquel or something, but like, or Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again. But I think Matrix Reloaded is genuinely good, not just ironic. It's fucking great.
Yes, it is a phenomenal sequel title for sure.
But how is it as a movie? That'll be our topic today. I think, let's give a quick preview, Sean, because people know my thoughts. I think I'm very loud about this on Twitter. The Matrix, I am very strongly of the opinion that the Matrix sequels are great. And I have been of that opinion for a while now. But Sean, this was your first time revisiting the movie in a long time, right?
Yes, I think probably the last time I would have seen this movie is like maybe sophomore year of high school, kind of like maybe even earlier than that. We had the DVD. But at some point we also lost the DVD because I do not have the DVD anymore, so I don't know what happened to it at some point.
Well, what are your sort of? I was going to say spoiler free. Spoilers don't matter, but you know, your reactions to this old movie.
Yeah, I'm honestly I'm a little mixed on it. Like there's stuff about it that I really love. I think conceptually it's all the right ideas for a sequel to The Matrix, and I love a lot of like the thematic elements of the film. I think some of the execution doesn't really do it for me in terms of. There's like a certain fuzziness of like character motivation and stuff like that, particularly for the middle section of the movie where a lot of the action is set. And I think I kind of find the action to be a little bit dull, not because the action sequences themselves are poorly done, but because the narrative around it doesn't sort of like push the action in a way that's super compelling to me. And so there's a certain amount of like the movie that I really wish was more kind of plotting and philosophical than it actually is, because when it's in its very philosophical mode, I really find it interesting. And then when it's more like, and it's the Matrix and we're going to do crazy Matrix shit, I don't find that side of the movie as compelling as I was kind of hoping to, revisiting it so much later.
Well, that's the end of the Weekly Stuff Podcast. We are canceling the show. I cannot abide anyone who didn't know. I'm kidding. That's interesting. I think this is going to be an interesting talk, because I also think just like on the level of action, I think this is like the most virtuoso action movie of its decade, at least in Hollywood. It's like the worst action scene in this movie to me is still better than like the best action scene in most movies of like certainly its era. So anyway, we will talk about all of that. I am excited for that. But you know, I think that's going to be the main thing today, because I do not have any news on the outline. I didn't see anything this week. I don't know if you had anything.
No, I don't think so.
And I don't have much stuff, honestly, but I'm curious if you have any stuff, Sean.
I do have a piece of stuff to address. This is addressed specifically to Occasional Thomas, all-time listener of the podcast, occasionally participant of the podcast, the Occasional Thomas. I am playing Persona 5 Royal. That game is fucking great. I don't know if like I feel like we maybe have like 10 hours of 10 plus hours for me of the podcast, because also there's when I played the Japanese version in late 2016 of the original Persona 5. But yeah, I have spent a lot of time in the past week playing Persona 5 Royal, and it's an absolutely phenomenal game. Like I think it is. I'm nowhere near close to getting to the end or like the latter sections of the game, which is where most of the new Royal content with like your new party member being a party member, and there's like a new dungeon, all that stuff I know, and there's like a lot of extra story stuff near deeper into the game. So I'm still like relatively in the early sections. I'm wrapping up the second palace. So like kind of the second dungeon in the game. So there's not a huge amount of impressions I can give on what is different about this specific version of the game, other than that it feels like this very nice sort of just like nice little tweaks here and there, just like kind of a tightening of different elements that they've done where it does feel like the Royal version kind of touches every piece of the game in kind of subtle ways to just kind of smooth it out even more. There are lots of smart little tweaks to the combat system, like the way that guns work in the game, that are a lot more kind of viable as a more normal strategy in combat, whereas that wasn't really kind of practical in the original game because of the way that ammo worked. And they've changed that. They've made the baton pass mechanic something that is like default by characters, so that it's like you can kind of pass on turns to other characters when you get a kind of critical hit or exploit an enemy's weakness. And every time you pass on a turn, it kind of levels up a character, which is an ability you had to unlock per character in the original game. That mechanic's just unlocked by default, and some of the new combat encounters are kind of designed more around being very thoughtful about how you use that mechanic, which is really cool. And then there's lots of just smart little smoothings out of like the pacing of it. Allows you to do more stuff at night and do it more frequently, which is a pretty common criticism of the original game, that you pretty frequently were not able to do any of the kind of like social activities at night during the story sections, and you had like big long story streaks that like you couldn't really do much gameplay stuff, and they've smoothed out a lot of that kind of pacing. So while I haven't gotten to the big new stuff in Persona 5 Royal, and this will be a while before I hit that, it is just a really nice, smart kind of version of the game that is taking, I think, every piece of the original game, both stuff that could use improvement and stuff that I would have thought was like, oh, this is basically perfect, but found room to improve everything pretty uniformly. And in that way, it feels a lot more kind of like Persona 3 Fest to me than it does Persona 4 The Golden. Where Persona 4 The Golden, while it is the better version of the game, and I like Persona 4 The Golden a lot, there are changes and things that they did to that game that I think kind of change it for the worse. And some of that is there's some tone stuff in the story. Some of that is I think they balance the game to make it a lot easier in Persona 4 The Golden. And that kind of stuff I don't think was like uniformly always for the better. And so far in Persona 5 Royal, everything I've read into has felt like this is a really smart choice of people that were very thoughtful about the game that they had made, seen the criticism of it, and had like maybe elements and things that they wanted to put into the game that they couldn't originally, and everything is just like tweaked and refined to this like extra level of perfection in what was already the most kind of like really refined and kind of polished entry in the series so far. So
yeah, that's what I'm curious about with that game, going back to it at some point, is I just regard the original Persona 5 as like so ludicrously polished already. I'm fascinated to see what are the things, like you're naming a couple of them, but I'm curious to see how that works, because I think that's one of the reasons why I hadn't felt as super motivated on it, is just because the original felt so polished. But, you know, I have heard that from you and from others, but I'm not playing it out of spite. I just, people have been saying it to me too much, so out of spite, nope, never playing it.
I do think one thing I'm enjoying is I am actually kind of glad that we have waited on it a little bit longer, because I think like having, especially for me, because I had already played Persona 5 twice, right? I had played the Japanese version, then I played the English version, and that was like playing that 100-hour long game 6 months apart. Like that wasn't even a year-long gap between my two playthroughs of Persona 5. And so having this extra time is really nice, because I mean it's been 4 years basically at this point since the original game, or like almost 4 years, and then it's been about 5 years since the Japanese version. So it's been about 5 years since I started playing Persona 5 originally, and so it's a good gap to kind of revisit that game. And in many ways, I also think that there are things about the story that are hitting me harder and kind of different than they did originally. I think partially because the game has a lot of like resonance, I think, with the kind of like Me Too or post Me Too, post Weinstein kind of culture, and the like, I'm going to use sneer quotes here, but like the cancel culture thing. Like, I don't want to like get into a cancel culture discussion, but because it's like an awful term, but when you use it, people understand what you're talking about, so you're kind of like resigned to have to use the term in some form. But it very much is it like playing with these ideas of like social media and of there's a lot of Gundam-y concepts very intentionally of like children and dealing with like adults and like corrupt adults and like the world that adults have created in their world, and this desire for justice and exposing crime and injustice in powerful individuals that feels like really resonant to me with kind of like the like different elements of the current culture, both in like the positive elements of that culture, then also some of the ones that like in smaller communities can be dangerous, with like the kind of like fervor that gets wrapped up in all of that. And so that element of the story, I'm actually like pretty fascinated by how differently kind of some of those different pieces of the story are inflected very differently for me based on like just things that have happened since that game came out, in ways that to me like make the story feel even richer, and it was already I thought quite a rich story in the first place.
Yeah, that makes me very excited. At some point, I don't know. I'm so busy. I have not like I have been playing games a little bit this last week. I'm particularly right now. I've been working through a game called Cyber Shadow, which is I mentioned that last week. It's an indie game that Yacht Club published, the studio that made Shovel Knight. They did not make this one, but they published it. That I think is just a phenomenal indie sort of 8-bit style game, sort of in the vein of like a Ninja Gaiden. And I'm going to talk about that more probably on the end of the year podcast, because I imagine that's going to be pretty high on my top 10. So I'll hold that because I'm still not done with it. But that's sort of what I've had the time to play, and that's a game like I play in like little 20-30 minute chunks. But yeah, I have not had a ton of time to dig into a game, so I've been a little intimidated. But at some point, I'm just going to have to bite the bullet and put that Persona 5 Royal disc in, and then lose my whole life to it.
Yeah, because I started playing it, I'm like, well, fuck, here I am. Like, here it is again. Like, I thought it's like, oh, I'm not going to get completely sucked up. I've already played this game to completion twice, and it's like, no, it is like so kind of like all-consuming, because it's just, you start playing it, you're like, yep, this is like one of the best video games I've ever played, so here we go.
Persona 5, here we go again.
Yep.
That's what they should have called it.
Made Persona 5 Reloaded.
Speaking of which, do you want to just use that as our transition to talk about Matrix?
Sure, might as well.
All right. Then this week's show is going to be all about The Matrix Reloaded. This movie, man, I have a lot of memories from when this came out, because I was too young to see The Matrix in theaters. And I was really too young to see The Matrix Reloaded in theaters either. But I was so invested in it. At that point, I kind of berated my parents. I saw The Matrix Reloaded at the Cinderella Twin Drive-In Theater in Denver, Colorado. This is a movie I saw for the first time at a drive-in movie theater. For people younger than us, a drive-in movie theater was a theater that was outside, and you would drive in your car, and it's like a big dirt parking lot, and there's a big screen that's basically just like a big wooden billboard, and then a shitty projector puts the movie on that, and you listen through the AM or FM radio in your car. It was a really weird way to watch a movie when I say that now. It was really cool. It was really fun. Nobody knows what those are anymore.
I like, Jonathan, you say that as if that is like a thing that is common to our generation. It's like, yeah, we all went to drive-in movie theaters. That's an old thing even when you saw The Matrix Reloaded. Like, that was an outdated, archaic way of seeing a movie in the fucking 90s, let alone the early 2000s.
But they still existed, is my point. Like, that was still like a big drive-in that was there and was popular, and like you had to get there early and stuff. Those, I mean, there is a drive-in that I've been to here in Iowa, but is a much smaller sort of thing. It's such a rare thing now. Like I know it was kind of archaic in 2003, but you know, we did do that as a family a lot, so I have memories of it.
Yeah, I have never actually been to a drive-in movie theater, which is why you being like, for people who it's like, I'm like, Jonathan, when we were kids, no, like if you said it's like, oh, I went to see a drive-in movie theater when you'd seen this movie, most of the people would be like, what the fuck are you talking about, Jonathan?
All right. Well, anyway, I'm an old soul. That's how I saw The Matrix Reloaded. I remember, this was one of the most hyped movies of all time. The Matrix Reloaded was also a just massive hit. It made, in 2003, $740 million. That would have been unbelievable today for like an R-rated movie. Like, that's up where like Deadpool and Deadpool 2 were, and were considered like groundbreaking R-rated, hits for like superhero movies. Matrix Reloaded was like a massive cultural moment. They made this and Matrix Revolutions, the third film, at the same time. They shot those movies between March 2001 and August 2002. It was like a 15-month shoot. Took forever, which means that like even though it took 4 years for Reloaded to come out, they were working pretty steadily from the moment that first movie came out, because writing those scripts and prevising everything, they were shooting less than 2 years after that first movie came out, the two sequels. And then this came out in May 2003, and Revolutions came out in November. Revolutions did not do as well. You'll notice that subsequent like 2-part movies like this generally did not do the like 5 months apart thing. They went for longer splits because Matrix Reloaded kind of, I think, cannibalized the box office of Matrix Revolutions 6 months later. But yeah, the one we're talking about today is The Matrix Reloaded. And of course, around this, we had the game Enter the Matrix, and we had the Animatrix, and everything else. One of the most hyped sequels of all time.
Yes, because we shouldn't forget that while they were filming Matrix Reloaded, Matrix Revolutions back to back, they were also filming the material in Enter the Matrix as well.
Yes.
So they were filming 2 movies and live action cutscenes for 1 video game, all in that section. So it is, I mean, it's like what we talked about on the last podcast of, while, you know, for people who are younger than us, it might seem weird to think of like the Matrix as this massive IP because it hasn't had like this long legacy, because there's only been like that a handful of movies in the couple of games basically. But like when this was happening, it felt like it was like the explosion of this massive new IP, massive new franchise where you've got the games coming out and the movies are coming out, and it kind of was like the Matrix was everywhere at this point.
Well, the Matrix had you. No, I mean, it was everywhere, and I think it's also worth saying it was a massive IP for its time. It's just our idea of massive IP now is like Marvel, and it will never end, and it will go forever, and there will be 5 movies a year, and 7 Disney Plus shows, and blah, 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 and like, you know, 7 of the 10 highest grossing movies of the year will be Disney releases, and like, you know, that just wasn't what things were like in 2003. So, yeah. Like, in 2003, things ended.
Yes.
They don't do that anymore.
We live in like the eternal media landscape of where there's like 3 movies and we just keep making those 3 movies. Yeah.
So, you know, look, Matrix Reloaded, I had gone a while without seeing the Matrix sequels, and then when I was putting my notes together last night for this podcast, Sean, I did go back and search out all my like old tweets. I do this sometimes because sometimes I have like, I use my Twitter as like notes almost, and I look up old ideas I had, and I found that the first time in recent years I had done a full rewatch of the Matrix trilogy was in July 2019, and then I did them all again when I got the 4K discs in January of this year, and then now October 2021 when we're doing this. So in the last 2 years, I have watched the trilogy now 3 times. This is my 3rd time through. And the first time I revisited The Matrix Reloaded, I definitely had this feeling of, okay, this movie is messy in some ways. I can see some of the seams, but man, what is brilliant about this movie is just so brilliant. And I think it's something I just feel when we go back to stuff like Lord of the Rings and Spider-Man 2 and some of the great stuff from this period, just like, oh, right, Hollywood doesn't make stuff like this anymore. Like this kind of movie on this level of imagination and like this level of craft, it's just not a thing. Just Hollywood doesn't do it. Just put it out of your mind. It's not a thing that exists anymore. And it is like kind of stunning now to go back and look at something that is like inventing as much as this movie is. I mean, the visual effects breakthroughs of this movie alone are just, I think people generally don't understand how much this movie broke through. Stuff like using a virtual camera, it was basically invented by this movie and is now a common thing that multiple movies have won Oscars for. But like, this movie invented that. It has amazing story stuff, I think. And, you know, so then I rewatched it again a year later, and I've rewatched it again now 6 months after that. And every time I watch it, I honestly, like, exponentially more, I find this movie fascinating. I find it so entertaining. I love all the component pieces. I think it has some of the best action scenes I've ever seen in a movie. I love this movie. And of course, I'm also inevitably reading this through the lens of, I know Matrix Revolutions very intimately also, and that does very much color my reading of this movie, which I might be a little different for you, Sean, because you haven't seen Revolutions in a long time either.
Yeah, I'll just like put my cards on the table. I remember very little of the Matrix Revolutions, and in fact, although actually I remember more of it than I realized, because some of the stuff, the Agent Smith stuff that's in Revolutions, in my memory was in this movie. So there's like pieces of that movie I'm like, oh, because it is very much while it is a much more elegant thing they do than the recent Dune movie, it is very much a part 1, part 2 kind of thing.
Yes.
So it is like some of like what happens in the next movie got mixed up in what happens in Reloaded in my head. But yeah, like outside of, I obviously remember the ending. I remember the giant Dragon Ball fight. I remember, spoilers. Neo dies. Yeah. Oh my God, spoilers. I remember that stuff. And I remember,
Sean, these movies are 18 years old. They're old enough to vote. Spoilers don't apply.
Yeah, I remember like the dawn. Like, it's like the ending of the trilogy is very distinct in my memory, but other than the fact that there's like action scenes and they're fighting like the machines and stuff in the real world, most of like the bulk of that third movie I just have no memory of whatsoever. So in many ways I am hitting Reloaded pretty fresh, in terms of like not necessarily remembering the specifics of all the stuff, and certainly like the thematic stuff that goes on in the third movie I can mostly guess at and not like specifically remember. So for me it is like definitely it is closer to hitting Reloaded fresh than I think like normally you'd have, just because it has been, I mean, at this point I'm pretty sure, unless I maybe saw it shortly on home video shortly after it was in the movie theaters, I maybe have only seen Matrix Revolutions in the movie theaters when I was like 12 years old. So and so my memory of that movie is going to be very, very fucking faint at this point.
Right. So yeah, and I'm just saying that not to discredit your opinion, Sean, just to say we're coming at it from slightly different angles.
Yeah.
This is almost like the opposite of how we do Gundam. I'm very intimately familiar with like I can recite the two Matrix sequels basically at this point, because I've watched them so many times in the last couple of years and thought about them and written about them, and I find them very fascinating. But yeah, and it is a part 1, part 2 thing. Like Reloaded starts with all of the crews having this meeting, learning about this Sentinel attack that is coming, and that is the plot of the two movies. Like the two movies take place in this big 72-hour block where the Sentinels are drilling down to Zion, and everything is very compressed as everything is happening. So Reloaded is very elegant, I think, in having its own sort of like story and thrust, and it does not end on like oh man, I only got half a story. It ends on like things have been resolved and new things have been set up, and then there's a pretty killer cliffhanger. But it is like, it's going to be a little awkward to talk about just because it is very much like a part 1 of two movies.
Yeah, and I think the character that like gets hit by that the most is Agent Smith, who has like some of the stuff in this movie is interesting, but he's got not a lot to do yet, because most of like what that character is, I feel like, is in the next movie the fact that he's like in the real world, and that's like kind of like the most of what they do in this movie is kind of set up the role that he's going to play in the next film.
Yeah, well, because he's not the focus of this movie. He is very much going to be the big bad for the third movie, and here he is this sort of menace that comes around and gets a couple of... I mean, he's fucking entertaining as hell in it. He's got some great scenes. Hugo Weaving is having so much fun, but yeah, he's not the big focus yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, where do you want to start? I mean, I think I've given a lot of my thoughts, and I think if anyone reads me at all online knows my thoughts on Matrix Reloaded. But do you want to go in depth on sort of your overall thoughts a little bit more, Sean?
Yeah, because I'll also talk like a little bit about like my history with the movie, because I do have very strong memories of this film. And I don't have like as strong memories of the third one. But partially because with this movie we did own the DVD, so I did watch it a couple of times when I was a kid on DVD. And yeah, like I definitely have like a lot of vivid memories of like loving a lot of like the action stuff. It's like the freeway chase scene is obviously like the thing, right? Like that's the big action set piece of this movie that like has always stuck out in my mind a lot. And so that stuff I always gravitated to a lot. And then I also, this movie has like a weird place in my heart, I guess, or like in my mind of like, I have such a like profoundly distinctive memory of watching this movie in the movie theater, or one part of this movie, because this is like, I don't know if this is exactly the first movie with a sex scene in it I've ever seen, but it is definitely the first movie I saw with a sex scene in it in a movie theater sitting next to my dad.
Yes,
and
me too. That's
the profound awkwardness of that experience and being like I gotta make sure I know what's going to be in these fucking movies before I go to with my parents anymore, because man, it is like, that is very awkward. Although that is one of those things where when you get to that scene where it's like, Hollywood movies don't have sex scenes in them anymore. And so it's like, there is something very nice about revisiting this, like what is an incredibly well done version of one of those. But when you're like an 11-year-old boy seeing this movie with your dad in a movie theater, it is definitely a like, sex ed class was like a fresh thing in my life at that point, so It's like definitely a very awkward, weird kind of coming of age moment. And so in many ways, like, this movie has like this like iconic part in the memory of my own childhood of like that kind of development that is I find very amusing, because it is just, of all the things in the movie, that is the one thing that like is going to be burned into my memory until the day I die, is the feeling of awkwardness and of like sitting in that seat watching this, being like oh, okay, this is a thing I have to experience and I have to like think about now with my dad right next to me.
So the reason we saw it at the drive-in movie theater is because my parents knew there was a sex scene in it, and they were fine with all the other stuff that made it an R rating. They didn't think it was, because the first movie is not inappropriate. It's fine.
Yeah, it's a couple of F-bombs and some blood, you know?
Yeah, it's, even then the violence is not very bloody. Yeah. So like, and you know, and I still think Matrix Reloaded, like, I think you could get that sex scene into a PG-13 movie if we did sex scenes in movies. There's nothing explicit in it. But like, my dad was a total fucking prude, and so like we saw it in the drive-in, so it was easier for them to cover our eyes. It was stupid. Anyway, you know, if any Americans listening, you know, we have a stupid, unhealthy, bullshit relationship with sex in movies, and it's gotten even worse over time, frankly, not better. I mean, we are at a low ebb, but we are like approaching a like fucking like 1950s people sleeping in separate beds era of like American cinema, with like how sexless movies have gotten.
Yeah, but in the 1950s, you at least had like people smoking after they're like very heavily implied they just fucked. Like,
Yes.
like even 1950s movies were way more horny than movies we get these days.
No, I mean, yeah, Captain America is a Ken doll. Everyone in, yeah, the only like Marvel superhero who we know has like genitalia is Iron Man, because he has a kid at the very, very end of his tenure. So there you go. Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, we'll talk about that more later, because it is, I think, one of the pivotal scenes of the entire trilogy.
Yeah. But anyways, that's kind of like some of my history, like memories of watching this movie. But yeah, so after seeing it in the movie theater, seeing it a couple times on DVD, like I definitely rewatched it, like when I watched The Animatrix for the first time and stuff like that. Like we talked about in the last podcast, there's just like a long part of my life where like The Matrix as a franchise was just kind of like dormant for me, because I just didn't go back and revisit it. So I was very excited to watch this movie, because like I was hoping to have like the kind of experience that I had rewatching the prequels for this podcast, in the sense of, obviously the famous thing or the infamous thing about the Matrix sequels is that they were like largely panned in broad popular culture, even though like at the time the Matrix Reloaded's critical reception was actually quite good. There's definitely, I think, a lot of revisionist history that I was kind of surprised looking at. It was like, no, like critics generally quite liked the Matrix Reloaded. It wasn't like, you know, like everybody thought it was an incredible masterpiece, but it wasn't something that like people just sort of like threw out into the street and like sort of just like beat like a dog or something, the way that I think these movies are generally thought of in popular culture, very much in the same framework as the prequels were.
It was, I will say, I think it is a mix of Revolutions was critically panned. That is just a fact when you look at the critical reception of that one. And then I think it was 2003 was probably an oversaturation of Matrix. Like, the public was just very oversaturated with 2 movies and all these games, and just, it was everywhere. The Animatrix was the same year. I mean, everything was like, it was just an absolute avalanche of Matrix stuff. And I think there was this sort of public pushback that you do see. Some later franchises, I think, learned some of the lessons of not going like all the fucking way in on something like that. But yeah, I think there was a public pushback more than there was a critical pushback, which is also kind of true of the Star Wars prequels if you go back and read the reviews. The Star Wars prequels were also not largely panned that way. That is also revisionist history. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and so like for a long time, I think one of the reasons why I didn't revisit The Matrix was just this like, there's that sense of just like cultural heaviness or something on you, especially like, you know, being like a teenager, of where you're like, oh, I can't go watch the bad movies. Now's the time in my life where I must go watch the good movies, right? Like it's very much that kind of like developmental period where it's like, you can't like the prequels because everyone says the prequels are bad. You can't like the Matrix sequels because everyone says that they're bad. So why bother go watching them again? Even if I do remember Morpheus with the katana was very cool. And so I didn't revisit those movies for a long time, and I really wanted to kind of reclaim the movie. And I don't know if I like, again, I can't really come at it and say that I feel like it is a like resounding success. I find I'm kind of conflicted on the movie because I feel the movie is kind of conflicted, of where I just wish that the movie was allowed itself to be more of the kind of like navel gazing philosophical like exploration of like the nature of free will than it actually lets itself be, because I think when it's doing that stuff I really love it. And some of like the dialogue scenes, like the scene between Neo and the Oracle, Neo and the Merovingian, Neo and the Architect, all those scenes I really find very interesting, and I enjoy that side of the movie of like this Neo going from like kind of like mentor figure, like, you know, early on he talks to the counselor or whatever, when they're in Zion, and him kind of like exploring this very mushy, vague, hard to define concept of like purpose and reason and like the why of, if you live in this like world where your choices are controlled for you, where do you find purpose or meaning in things, kind of is sort of part of his exploration. And I find that very interesting. But I think when that then comes into contact with, and now we have to do like big crazy Matrix fights, like I kind of feel like those two sides of the movies destroy each other to me a little bit, of where I find myself kind of not super interested anymore in the action stuff, which is a complete flip of how I used to feel about the movie. It used to be like, all the talking, I don't know, it's weird. Like, it's just a lot of people sitting in a room talking about like weird, vague philosophical concepts. I want to get to the part where they have the big fight scenes. And then now I kind of like want the fight scenes to wrap up, because I want them to get back to exploring some of the more of like the thematic elements of the movie. And I think part of it is because the movie's interest is so, I think, like it's so broadly philosophical. It's moved a lot away from, I think, the more kind of symbolic, multivalent symbol approach of the first movie to being this more kind of just like generally philosophical exploration. And that means that a lot of the character stuff is more abstract. And that abstractness, or that remove, I feel, from like a connection to the main characters, then means that I don't find the action to be motivated in a way that makes the action compelling to me, even if I think the action is, on a very technical level, generally speaking, very well constructed. I think the storytelling around it, I just kind of wish... I wish the movie could be more of like an art house film, and it was just a bunch of people talking for 2 hours about cool stuff, is kind of, I guess, my takeaway from watching the movie.
I get what you're saying, but what's funny is that I think in the public consciousness, that's the problem with the movie for most people, is that I think most people completely forget that there is a lot of action in this movie. I think most people, if you listen to like how are the Matrix sequels remembered in popular consciousness, they were remembered as like talky, heady, up their own ass, navel-gazing philosophical movies with nothing to say, that are just like people sitting in rooms talking for a bunch of the time. That's wrong. That's not what either of these movies are. Revolutions is also very action-heavy. But like, that is completely the memory of it. And it is, I do think it is still striking to watch a movie like this that is a Hollywood movie that cost $150 million, that made almost $1 billion, that was this giant fucking thing, that has significant, heavy, huge stretches of time devoted to philosophical conversations. Like, that Oracle scene is not short, and it is followed up by a big conversation with Agent Smith that then leads you to the Burly Brawl, which is great. But, like, you know, you have the scene with the Merovingian, which is, like, probably the most, like, alienating scene to a lot of people with this movie, is this just long conversation in this restaurant where he makes a woman come with a piece of chocolate cake. And it's like, and I find that fucking great. And to me, like, the magic of The Matrix and of the Wachowskis is that you can have that scene, and 20 minutes later, Morpheus is cutting a car in half with a katana and an Uzi. Like, that is The Matrix to me, is like that fucking blend right there. But definitely in the public consciousness, the amount of ideas going on in the movie is the, like, you realize that what people, like, gravitated to in the first Matrix, I think, that made it popular was, like, the style and the aesthetic and the action and stuff. And so when the movies kind of double down on, or the sequels do have a lot of philosophizing and ideas, and, like, they want you to think, I really do think these movies want you to think actively. That is part of what I think gets them so resoundingly rejected. In the same way I do think there's some of that with the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah. Like, it's definitely... The movie is asking you to, like, directly interrogate your preconceptions about choice and free will. And then how much of that you then want to extend it to, like, we live in a society, right, of, like, the sort of, like, Marxist elements of the movie. But it does want you to engage directly with the philosophical concepts. But there is a part of that where, like, the first movie, you can very easily watch the first movie, have a very fun experience, and not like think about anything in it. But the first movie does have like every part of it is so elegantly constructed to like create this very powerful whole that is exploring like really deep, interesting, evocative ideas. And it is this like perfectly cohesive movie to me. Whereas like I think that is my issue with The Matrix Reloaded is I don't find all the like sort of disparate elements of the movie don't necessarily cohere to me into like one larger whole. And maybe part of that is because part of it is that it's a one half of a like two-part structure. So maybe that will be fixed in some ways by me like revisiting and more deeply engaging with Matrix Revolutions. But it does feel like I can't escape the feeling of like watching sections of this movie and getting to that freeway chase scene and just like enjoying it on a technical level, but kind of looking at my watch a little bit being like, well, can we wrap this up? Because I feel like there's a lot more stuff that I want you guys to get to or to explore conceptually with the story you're telling, and a giant action scene that Neo is not involved in any way that is about a character, the Keymaker, who is like basically just a plot device. There's not a lot of like strong narrative motivation pushing through that action scene to me to justify like the scale of all of it. And that's kind of like, you know, my problem with the movie in the nutshell is like I wish that it was more focused and cohesive with like what it wanted to focus on. And then I think it would have then made both the philosophical elements and the action stuff work a lot better for me than I actually feel like they did.
Yeah, so I mean, and I will say, I am 100% of the opinion the first Matrix is, if we want to do the conversation, the best one. Like, I don't super care about that conversation, but like it is the most cohesive. It is the most perfect. I mean, the original Matrix is one of the most perfect like Hollywood movies ever made. It's flawless. I don't think there's any version of a Matrix sequel that would be worth doing that would not be messier than the original Matrix. Mm-hmm. Like that is part of just like, I think there is a necessary messiness to these sequels that I think a lot of people have pushed against, and I guess my view has always been, if you are going to make a sequel that is actually a worthy successor to the like size of the ideas and the world that the first Matrix is introducing, it's going to have to be messier than that first movie. I just think that is an inevitable thing, and I do think some of the most interesting movie sequels are a little messier. I sometimes get pushback on this. I think The Empire Strikes Back is a messier movie than Star Wars. Like, it is its structure is a little weird in places. Its pace is a little weird. Now, notice I'm not saying bad, because I don't think that makes it bad, but it is like, it splits up the cast, and it is a little less like propulsive and all of that, and that makes it richer, I think. I think it's also true of like The Godfather Part 2. When you look at the great sequels, they often are a little messier and a little like more diffuse and take more time to kind of land their punches. And I do think that about the Matrix sequels, and I do think you kind of have to view them together. But I also think Reloaded on its own, the more I've watched it, because I will say in like 2019, my first rewatch in several years, when I came back to it, I did have, I think, some of what you were saying here, Sean, where I did feel some of that like lack of cohesion bothered me, even as I just found the like amount of things it was doing that I found very strong, like very much pulled me through. But yeah, I it's not like I don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and I agree that, like, you know, I want to make it clear that, like, my issues with the movie, like, are still, like, on the scale of, like, I agree with what you say about that Hollywood doesn't make like, movies like this in general, but certainly, like, the approach to sequels is so much more comfortable and safe. And it's part of what we talked about on the last Matrix podcast is there's something I very much respect about the Wachowskis' approach of like shutting down the like eternal Matrix IP take on it, right? That this movie is not a like simple, and now where's like another adventure that we have in the Matrix, and we have a bunch of more just like kung fu fights, and it's sort of the same story again, only like a little bit more bombastic, which is the approach that like 90% of Hollywood sequels just take. They're like, it's you know, another adventure with Iron Man, it's another adventure with Captain America, and those sequels can still be fun. There's nothing necessarily wrong with just having a like, we're just gonna have a good time and make a very sort of standard normal sequel to a movie, but it's never going to be something that is like as bold or compelling or interesting as really going for it and trying to break fresh ground and really complicate your understanding of the original movie and what it was doing. And that is the approach that the Wachowskis take, is that it is this movie is one that is trying to sort of like fracture the much more sort of basic takes on the original Matrix. It is not something that I don't think like. I think you can see a lot of what this movie is doing in the original Matrix, because a lot of what this movie does is stuff that the original Matrix movie suggests, like the fact that this was not the first time they have made a Matrix, is a thing that the first Matrix says. That's not a fact that the architect introduces to you for the first time. If you're like paying attention to that first movie, a lot of those ideas are there. They're just like not fully explored. So it's not doing something that is totally like unwarranted or out of nowhere, but it is like really digging into weird corners that are sort of evoked or suggested by that first movie and breaking it up and exploring it and getting in there. And it just is not interested in being a very safe sequel. And so that is going to create a lot of messiness. I think they still could have done better with like the messiness that is there. I don't think it needs to be as sort of like fragmented and disparate as it is. But all that being said, this approach that they take is definitely like a much more interesting and preferred approach to The Matrix 2, Here We Go Again, which it's very easy to imagine another world where that is what we had. And right now we're watching, we're doing a podcast breaking down the 12 episode long Matrix HBO Max reboot or whatever,
Jesus Christ. Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. And I very much think, and I think if you particularly read some of what I've said about, like, the architect, and at some point I'm going to have to actually expand this into, like, an academic paper or something, I think The Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions are also kind of a refutation of the idea of sequels in a lot of ways, like, or our normal perception of sequels. I think they are very meta in a lot of ways, and I think in very interesting and productive ways, and honestly in ways that I think have made the movies more interesting with age, not less. Like, I think the stuff with the architect is fucking prophetic in terms of what it is saying about the audience's relationship with, like, explicability in storytelling. Like, I think this movie is prophetic. And I think there's stuff like that is just brilliant. And, I guess I think you and I are on the same page here in that I am just so much less interested in the conversation of, are the Matrix sequels good, than are they interesting? And, like, you and I having this sort of frankly mild disagreement on, like, does it work for us 100%? That's fine. What I won't abide and what pisses me off in the conversation about these movies is the dismissal and the shutdown of, like, they're just up their own ass, or there's nothing there, or blah, 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 or they're the bad ones, and all of this stuff. And that's the stuff that pisses me off, because I think there is the refusal to engage with the movies, which is also, I think, kind of what the movies are about, is like, and it's the same thing with the Star Wars prequels. That's what pisses me off, not so much whether or not you, quote unquote, like them. Like, do you know what I mean, Sean?
Yes.
Like, and I know this is like a hard nuance to get across in the year of our Lord 2021, where we have just reduced everything to the stupidest ways of talking about media, but, like, boy, Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions are not sequels built for 2021 in that way. Like, you extra would not make a movie like this today, because the audience would just revolt. Like, they just shut down if this came out today, because it's like it's asking too much of you at a certain point. And I don't want to come off as elitist and like you're stupid if you don't like these movies. That's not quite what I'm saying. But I do think you're kind of stupid if you're not willing to engage with them. That's kind of where I'm at. Yeah,
it's not a movie that is going to be palatable to people who want to turn their brain off and just enjoy an action movie, right? It's simply not that kind of movie. There's nothing wrong with, like, just dumb action movie that you turn your brain off, right? I had a lot of fun halfway through this movie having the revelation that the actor that plays Seraph in this movie is also the bad guy in Flashpoint, Donnie Yen Kung Fu movie, and I took a bathroom break in the middle of Matrix Reloaded, and then I just watched the last fight of Flashpoint on YouTube, because I was like, I just have to get that out of my system before I continue to watch this movie, because it blew my mind when I realized that is who that guy is, because I've never seen him in another movie. And Flashpoint, amazing kung fu movie. I would not spend like any of my life thinking any deeper about that film than the action scenes are really good, because that's all that movie wants to be. That's not what the kind of movie Matrix Reloaded wants to be. It's just not a turn your brain off and just like go with the flow kind of thing. It is asking you to think about the dialogue and like the themes and the ideas that the characters are expressing to you. And so, yeah, I'm with you, Jonathan, that like this is a movie that like you shouldn't you can't be dismissive of. You have to like engage with what it is saying and what it is doing, whether or not you like it and like the execution of everything. To that extent, is beyond the point. Like the point is, are you engaging with the ideas and are you approaching the movie on the level that it is wanting and inviting to be approached on?
Yeah. And, and I do see kind of what you're saying. There is a tension because this is the most action heavy of the three Matrix movies. It's much action heavier than the first movie. And it is like, there is a certain tension between all of that. And, the highway chase is kind of I wouldn't say turn your brain off because it is such a complicated, like, virtuoso sequence. But, like, the movie is also willing to reward your patience with the most fucking kick-ass action ever. And I do think I had a revelation watching the movie last night that, like, this movie is paced like a musical. This movie is paced like the action scenes are songs. Like, they are big musical set piece numbers that are just giant expressive things that kind of explode in the middle of the movie, and then you go back into slightly more sober territory. And I find that very invigorating. I do also see what you're saying with it, because there is an internal tension there that is also, I think, in the original Matrix, and is maybe a little cleaner in the original Matrix and comes out more productively.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I just think the original Matrix is, like, the thing that pushes the original Matrix through all that stuff is the fact that it is also a hero's journey story, right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yeah, and so that plotting then makes it so that the action feels very immediate and relevant to what is going on in the plot and with the characters in a way that I don't think that is true of a lot of the action stuff in The Matrix Reloaded, and is what I think the movie could most improve on, is finding a way to sort of synchronize a lot of what it is trying to say in its plot stuff and its like more character dialogue focused moments, and then like the big spectacular action scenes, they feel like they were like shot with those sequences, to me, feel like they were made with very different intentions or something, and I wish that it was more cohesive in that way, with like a more singular purpose driving all those sequences throughout the movie. But if, like, with the musical connection, it maybe makes sense, because I also typically don't like musicals. It is very rare that I see a musical that I like. So maybe that's what it is.
But you see what I mean with it, right? It is this kind of like, there's something almost extra diegetic when the movie jumps into action mode. And like, the highway, like, the difference is that the best action in the first Matrix, like the big fight with Smith at the end, is the expressive culmination of Neo's character arc and a lot of the ideas in the movie, right? So, like, you are so in the zone. The big highway chase in this movie is a little bit of a reward for the audience, and also it's a Trinity and Morpheus's moment to shine. Like, that is what that scene is designed to do, is to give Trinity and Morpheus, like, their big moment in the sun. Because otherwise, like, I'll just say Morpheus does kind of get left by the wayside in the third movie, and just in general, him being the kind of mentor figure from the first movie doesn't have as much to do in the sequels. And then Trinity, otherwise in this stretch of the movie, wouldn't have had as much to do. So that's kind of what that's designed to do, but it is not as clean a, like, propulsion as the first movie has. Like, that's obvious. That's, yeah.
But for Morpheus, at least he got, like, an incredible power-up. He is so much more powerful in this movie than he was in the first one. It's like, he goes toe-to-toe with an agent for, like, a solid 5 minutes.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
that dude did some serious kung fu shit between the two movies.
I mean, that's my point of, like, I do understand the critique of, like, the highway chase in the middle. Also, it's one of the most impressively mounted action scenes in the history of cinema, and it has Morpheus going around with a katana, fighting agents, cutting a car in half. It's just, I mean, I don't know. I can't complain about something that fucking pure and good. But let's go ahead and... No, you're wrong. All right, let's go in. Let's jump in, Sean, and talk about The Matrix Reloaded a little more in depth. So, I think the first act of this movie and the first major, like, stretch to talk about is probably Zion, because that is basically the first act of the movie. And I really do think the stretch in Zion in this movie is one of the most remarkable chunks of world building I've ever seen in, like, modern Hollywood. It is such a cool realization of this city we had heard about in the first movie, and I think it is a really cool expansion of a lot of the themes the movies are working with. Building to the Zion rave, which is one of the often maligned scenes in this movie, and I think I could argue is the most pivotal, like, thematic scene in the trilogy, I think, in a lot of ways. And I wonder if the Wachowskis would say that, because I think their hearts are very aligned with what's going on in that scene.
Yeah, that scene in its construction, I think, are really critical, and it's something we talked about in the first Matrix, is like you need this like very kind of human connection, because you're doing this contrast between the human and the machine, with the machine also being this sort of like broad metaphor for like systems and like the systems of power that control and manipulate you, right? And so like you do need, I think, a strong contrast between the sort of like cold, like harsh, unforgiving, brutal logic of the systemic level with the sort of like warm, powerful comfort of, and like very human, physical, meaty body part of like being a person living in the world. And that's very much what that scene is, and it is, I think, a absolutely necessary thing that's like the Matrix movies need. I do kind of wish that it, like, its placement in the movie feels a little bit awkward to me in the sense of like it doesn't have a lot of buildup within this movie in and of itself. It feels like a lot of the buildup to that scene is kind of leftover stuff from the first movie. Of you don't really get in that first movie the full kind of big romantic culmination of Neo and Trinity. You get them having the kiss at the end, right? But this is a much more sort of like strong, intimate, very beautiful sequence with the two of them together. And I do wish that there was some other way to kind of construct things. And I don't know how you would do it, because the movie is like trying to do a lot of stuff. But there is something a little bit weird about the pacing of putting like the big speech that Morpheus gives and all of that, and this big sort of powerful, intimate moment right at the beginning of this movie. Because that is like the stuff that sets everything in motion. And that's one of the elements I'm a little conflicted about, of like, I feel like you could have had a more strong payoff that this is doing by having a build up to it, but also what the movie is wanting to do is using that as like basically like an inciting incident to create the motivation for Neo of what he is exploring and trying to figure out for the rest of the film.
Yeah, I've felt that before, because the Matrix Reloaded does have this, it's a slow first act, like relatively speaking. It is this big sort of immersive chunk of world building, culminating with the, you know, set piece that is the rave intercut with the sex scene. But it is basically like a first act that is largely just sort of world building, and not like to your face exposition, but expositing like what the stakes are and what this part of the world looks like and all of that. And I've definitely felt that in some other viewings, and I very much over the years, and in certainly the last time I watched it and this time, very much came down on the side that I just find it a very compelling way to start the movie. You know, there is the other side of this, that in Revolutions, most of Revolutions is set in Zion. Like, there is actually very, very little of Matrix Revolutions that happens in the Matrix. It's a little tiny bit at the beginning, and then Neo and Smith at the end. And otherwise, it is all in the real world. And so the Matrix Reloaded goes much harder on the Matrix side of the equation after you get out of Zion. Really, you're in the Matrix for the rest of the movie. You're almost never in the real world, except for that little tiny bit at the end. But it works for me, and I think part of it is, again, I just find it like such a cool piece of world building. I think the design of Zion, this whole idea of this city that is down, and it's what they told us in the first movie, that it's down closer to the core of the Earth, or down underground, not close to the core of the Earth, but it is down further because it is warmer the further you go down, and it is this city sort of built on machines, but also feels like very raw and real. And it is this like big multi-ethnic community, and it's this assemblage of people who are like, you know, fully like real humans with none of like the like mechanized pieces from the Matrix, mixed with all the people who have been freed. And you get all of these sort of internal politics where you have like the character Locke, who is played by Harry Lennox, who is kind of the asshole, but also I completely understand why Locke just fucking hates Morpheus. Because
I mean, he's, to be fair, he's 100% right for the whole movie. Like,
yes,
there's just like, I've watched the whole movie, is like, because one of the things I remembered about Matrix Reloaded is like, oh, of course, like the prophecy is like, is, you know, religion is the opiate of the masses kind of thing. It's another form that the Matrix uses to control and manipulate people. So it's like, I feel really bad for that guy, because it's like, man, you're right the whole time, and everyone's just shitting on you, and it's like, you're right, like, this is all horse shit, and you should be, like, protecting you and yours, instead of going off on this, like, weird namby-pamby fucking philosophical journey trying to figure out your, like, one bullshit in the Matrix. It's like, let's get real and, like, fight the fucking system, bro.
the movie's not unaware of it. I mean, like, a lot of Morpheus's arc in this movie is one of being humbled. Like, the movie ends with him looking at the Nebuchadnezzar exploding and him reciting the "I dreamed a dream" thing from the Bible. Like, it's, it's intentional.
Yeah.
And certainly Locke gets to be right in the third movie to a certain degree. But yeah, I mean, there's all of that, and meeting Niobe, who's a really cool character, who
star of hit video game Enter the Matrix, Niobe, with her friend Ghost. That I didn't remember that Ghost, who is the other playable character in that game, you could choose between the two protagonists. He's got like one line of dialogue in this movie. I thought he had more stuff to do.
What I love about Niobe, who's played by Jada Pinkett Smith, and Ghost, is that like, they look like video game characters, like, completely. Yes. They like, it feels like the design was done in the video game, and then they went and like put all of that on the people, because it's such like her, like the way she has the sunglasses and the hair and the jacket and all of that. Because I remember playing Enter the Matrix, and it is such a like striking video game character to play,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. She's like the only character that's not wearing either all black or all white, like everybody else. She's like, I'm going to go for this like kind of leather red look.
Yeah, totally. But, and I love, one thing I really like about Reloaded is it feels like there's this whole other movie or two that happened between the first movie and this one. There is this real suggestion that, like, the characters went on living lives in between the two movies. And this is, like, what Empire Strikes Back does that I really love. That Empire Strikes Back picks up and, like, the rebellion has like moved to Hoth, and like all this stuff has happened, and Han has been like targeted by all these bounty hunters, and Luke has learned all of these new powers and all of this stuff. And I think there's a very similar feeling here that is probably pretty directly inspired by Empire, which is the model for a lot of movie sequels. But I like that like Neo has been to Zion before. He's garnered a legacy. He's become this messiah. He saved this kid, that kid who's always like following him around in Zion, who I like that kid. I think that's a like fun, like adorable kind of little side of the movie. He's honed his powers. I just think it makes the world feel very alive when you come into the sequel and like, oh, the world has continued in the 4 years since the last movie came out.
Yeah, and I do think that, because I do like that, and I generally like that when a sequel's like, let's just move it ahead, rather than like, it's just a much more efficient approach rather than having to always set a sequel like right after the events of the previous movie or anything like that. But part of that does create, I think, that sense of like the first act of this movie feels like it could be the second act of a different Matrix movie, and I think that's part of what I'm saying of like that build-up payoff thing with the rave and Morpheus's speech is like you could very easily see that being like the end of the second act of a Matrix movie, that the third act is then the machines immediately after that just attacking Zion, and that's just what like the story is. And there's like interesting, I think, kind of like playing with pacing and kind of narrative expectation with that, of that you're very much kind of, as a viewer, you're set a bit adrift in the beginning of this movie, not knowing exactly where you are relative to everything else that has happened, because it is several months after the end of the last movie.
Yeah, it's at least 6. They have one reference to, I think in the official canon, it's supposed to be like 6 months. It feels longer than that to me. But yeah, I it does feel like there is the Matrix 2, here we go again, happened somewhere in the middle there, where like you had another adventure where like Neo saved this kid in the Matrix, and like maybe even the Matrix 2 was like this from the kid's POV as he meets Neo, the superhero, or something. I can very much imagine that.
Yeah,
and
I definitely read the kid as being basically like he is the audience insert from the end of the first movie of like who Neo is talking to. And you can very much, I think, see that of like the Matrix 2, here we go again, opening with that same speech that Neo gives, only it is not just to vaguely the audience, it is specifically the audience like personified in the movie as the kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like all of that. And I think there's just a significant investment in building Zion as a community with its own aesthetic, some of its own rituals, its own visual palette, and I think all of that is cool and important, and is a lot of where I think the Wachowskis' hearts are at, especially when you get to the third movie, and so much of it happens in Zion. It is so much of the purpose of the first act of this movie is to kind of lay down the base level of like, what are the characters fighting for? Because if you were just continuing from the first movie of like, the basic thing you're fighting for in that first movie is getting out of that system of control and sort of figuring out Neo's powers and all of that, that's not going to sustain a sequel. That's not going to sustain 2 movies, especially if you're going to do what these movies do, which is the big like finale where we're going to end the fucking story, you know. And so putting that investment in Zion, I think, is interesting. We do have one significant new character here that's worth talking about, which is the Harold Perrineau character, who plays the new what do you call it, controller or whatever on the Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, he's Link, who I think is supposed to be like the brother-in-law of, because you have a couple of scenes. You have what's her name?
Gina Torres is there.
Gina Torres, who I think is supposed to be the wife of like Dozer from the first movie, and then Link is her brother, and that's why he is on the Nebuchadnezzar, because Tank and Dozer got fucked up, and now he's taking their place. And I do think Harold Perrineau is an awesome actor, and I like having him here.
Yeah, it took me about 30 minutes to realize this, like, oh shit, right, that's the dude from Romeo and Juliet. It's Mercutio in Romeo plus Juliet, because I've seen that movie too many times through like the professional hazard of being an English teacher. It's like also never on purpose have I watched it, but I have ended up seeing that movie about 4 times. So
to be fair, he might be the best part of that movie.
Yeah, it's him and John Leguizamo are the 2 actors in that movie that like get it. So yes, like that is not a diss to Harold Perrineau. Like his take on Mercutio is like one of the few, I think, performances of that movie that actually really worked for me. So
yeah, he was also on Lost. He was on Oz. He was a big actor in this period, and I do like him in here. Even though I guess the implication is Tank died. Tank seemed like he was going to live at the end of the first Matrix, or maybe he just had to retire. I'm not sure, but it's a bummer.
We don't know how advanced their medical like science or like access to medicine is. Like he got pretty fucked up. I would not be surprised if it's like, he got an infection. Too bad we can't make antibiotics because we're like 100 people living under the Earth's fucking crust in a like machine dominated hell. So it's tragic, but it's how it goes.
Yeah, but I actually really like him in this movie. I think one of the things he just has so much personality, and I love, he's the guy, behind the screen watching everyone, and there's a bunch of moments where he becomes the audience insert where Neo will do something fucking crazy, and then you'll see his reaction shot like, fuck, that was fucking crazy, and I always like those moments. I think he plays those well.
Yeah, it always makes me wonder, like, what does the code look like that's very different when Neo is, like, flying at Superman speeds through a city that's like, holy shit, look at this fucking code, that's nuts. Yeah,
it's pretty great. Anyway, all right, so you have all of that in Zion. What else to say? Like, I do want to talk about the rave scene in particular, but anything else in this stretch of the movie and sort of the world building is very cool.
Yeah, the world building is really interesting, and it's very necessary, right? Like, they need to sort of establish and invest you in the, like, actual human community for the kind of bigger scale story that they're interested in telling. If there's one change I would make at this section of the movie is, like, I do think the movie needs to have earlier on, like, more of, like, a strong sort of visual, like, a scene, something that more visually and, like, kind of immediately gives the audience this feeling of like building dread of the machines approaching Zion. There's this kind of awkwardness of you have a lot of conversations at the beginning of the movie of different groups of characters talking about the machines assembling this army, the army approaching Zion, all that stuff. And there's a sense of like, it's I wish it wasn't as presented so abstractly just through characters talking about it. Like I really do think that the movie would have improved by having like a good, like Saruman and Isengard kind of sequence of us like really seeing that happen, to build like a sense of immediacy around that, because it is the driving force of the plot, is what is setting everything in motion. It is the thing that is motivating everybody, but it is presented so abstractly until the end of the movie where you actually see the machines like really there, that I think it is one of the things that makes some of the action throughout the movie feel a little bit limper than it needs to, because there's not a plot motivated sense of urgency that I think is like really there for the audience.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I think that and I wonder why that is, because I have in my head the money shots of like in Revolutions. There's scenes where you see like the Sentinels pouring into Zion, and it is astonishing. And I wonder if there was a sense of like, we want to hold back because we're going to do this big money shot. Certainly, they had the money to do whatever they wanted with these movies. Is very clear. It does feel like so. The structure of this movie, you open with like your cold open, which is Trinity, and it's a very clear like callback to the first movie, but this time it's a scene where she dies at the end, and it is Neo's like prophecy dream sequence to what's going to happen to her, right? And you have that. Then you have them on the Nebuchadnezzar getting ready to go Link in. You have that quick scene where you meet Link, the Harold Perrineau character, and he has this talk with Morpheus about, like, you have to trust me, which is sort of Morpheus's reintroduction into the movie. And then you have the big scene where they're having the meeting of all the captains that Niobe is running, and Niobe tells you that there's 1,000,000 sentinels coming down to Zion, and then Morpheus says the great line of, like, why would it not make sense? One for every man, woman, and child in Zion. Is that not the logic of a machine? And I'm like, yeah, Lawrence Fishburne, I fucking love you. And then you have a thing with Agent Smith, quick fight, and then you're into the Zion stuff. And I do think there's probably, like, maybe in between the Nebuchadnezzar scene and, like, when you have the meeting with Niobe, there should be, like, a cutaway to a machine. Like, I like the idea of machine Saruman of, like, all of the sentinels, like, preparing, and like I can even imagine the scene. It should be something like there's a couple of sentinels, like, drilling away, and then you kind of pan out and go, and there's 1,000,000 of them, right? And I guess, to be fair to the Wachowskis, if you read this in the, like, extra textual way, that is what the last message of the Osiris short is. That's part of the Animatrix that was released before this movie. And there's always been a criticism that there are a couple of things that feel like they are in the game or in the Animatrix that should be in the movie proper, and that probably is one of them. Like, there should be, like, a touch of that in this movie. I think that's very true.
Yeah, because I think it would just be a lot simpler to just have one of the first scenes in the movie be the Nebuchadnezzar is the team that sees and, like, discovers that army or whatever. Like, something more just like, you know, it is there's a certain amount of, like, bulk to the movie that some of it is, like, very needed of, like, expanding its, like, world building and all of that, but I think also some of it of like you know, there's, like, that subplot between Morpheus and Niobe that I know that stuff will continue in the next movie, but, like, some of that, like, there's, like, a expansiveness or a sprawl to some of, like, what the movie is doing with the number of characters and, like, little subplots and stuff that I think, like, could have been pruned to make it more, like, efficient and give the movie more space to go deeper into, like, the stuff that most interests it. And that's definitely one of those areas where having this, like, abstract scene of us talking about the threat of these machines is not super compelling compared to just being able to see it, deliver that in a way that is, like, very immediate to our main characters to give us that sense of urgency that then can carry us through the rest of the plot.
No, I totally agree. And it is odd and notable because these movies don't generally have a show versus tell problem, right?
Yeah.
It is, like, this is probably the biggest gap in the whole trilogy on that regard. I do think what you, like, and I do agree, there's some pruning that could happen. I also think it's notable, just comparing this to modern movies. This movie's 138 minutes long. The first movie was 136 minutes long. The final movie is, like, 128. I think it's if this were made today, this would be, like, 3.5 hours long. Like, there would be, like, you know, just the bloat of sequels. Like, if you make one movie that's kind of good, then the next one has to be 155 minutes, is how I think it always has to happen now. And occasionally that works. Like, the new James Bond movie has a justified length. The James Bond movie before it did not. So I just, you know, that's also kind of funny to watch a big Hollywood sequel that is not a full 2.5 hours is wild.
Yeah, it is definitely, yes. It's like getting movies that 90 minutes to 2 hour range. Like, that's a very comfy place for most movies. And if you're getting much bigger than that, you should have a very good reason for why you're getting that much bigger than that.
I think that's generally true.
Yeah.
All right. So you have the big Zion rave scene. You have Morpheus's big speech. You have the rave itself. I think, you know, and I've said this many times, I think it's one of the pivotal scenes of the entire trilogy. I think there's the obvious level of it just, you know, it is a scene about the things that are being fought for and a statement of humanity, but it is such like a like bold, interesting sexual statement of humanity. It is this vision of like the number of extras on set is wild. It's more than you usually see in something like this, and then obviously digitally extended throughout that whole cavern, and you have all these bodies in rhythmic physical contact. And it is not purely heteronormative. There are a lot of, like, women and men grinding on each other. And it is intercut with this Neo-Trinity sex scene that I would not call, like, graphic, because it does not, like, cut to any of the, like, no-no zones that you're not allowed to show in movies. But it is, like, very hot. Like, and I think the whole scene is, like, I think, you know, sometimes when people talk about, like, the female gaze. And like sometimes people have the wrong idea of like the female gaze is just women looking at men like men look at women, and that's not what it means. And I had to teach that to my students like last week when I taught feminism and film theory, because the male gaze also is not as simple as just like people being sexualized on screen. But like in theory about the female gaze, it's often talked about that like, and this is something talked about also in like women focused pornography or something, is like focus on the face and like actual like showings of pleasure rather than just like the body as like something to be seen and like digested like carnally. And I do think that is going on in this scene where most of the focus of the Neo Trinity sex scene is on bodies in contact and then specifically on their faces, and like explicitly you have a long hold on Keanu Reeves and then on Carrie-Anne Moss's face when the characters like orgasm. And then you have a lot of like focuses of like bodily contact in the rave scene. And it is extra startling in 2021 when you're like, this is a movie with the Warner Brothers logo on it and people fuck in it. But also like, it's just generally in like American cinema of this level. Like, you know, I'm teaching this week, I just finished preparing my lecture for it, Queer Theory in Film. It's a very gay sequence in like a million ways, like in how it is showing like the rave and like, and I think the kind of subculture a lot of like its visual imagery is coming out of. It is like a really interesting vision of sexuality and like bodily, like embodiment of pleasure in cinema. And I can't really think of an analog in a movie of this size made for a mainstream audience of this scale. I just can't think of another scene like it.
Yeah, because I 100% agree with you, and I think it's a really good take that it is a scene that like it's very, as you say, it's very focused on showing like the effect of the pleasure that the characters are feeling as expressed on their faces, and there is something to me that is like almost kind of startling in a like modern American movie context of it's not just like a sex scene, it is a sex scene that like, well, you don't see any fluids or whatever. It is like showing like the sexual intercourse to its completion, right? Like it is very, you know, especially if you have already taken sex ed, you know exactly what is happening in that scene, whether they are graphically, explicitly showing what is occurring, like within the body, right? So that is something that like you will occasionally get like a sex scene or like an implied sex scene. But I think like sex scenes showing like the completion or like the culmination of a sexual act, like whether or not it's shown totally explicitly, like that's definitely even more rare. But it is something that I think like is really elegantly done here. And then there's also something there's like interesting visual shorthand of when you know, when Neo climaxes, that he then immediately has that vision again, and this like, you know, that the moment of clarity post-climax, right, giving him like post-coital this vision of
a literal little death.
Yes, that's where I was going to go. Like it is the French expression, it is the little death, which is, you know, the expression for what the orgasm is, and that leading to his vision of Trinity dying that you saw at the beginning of the movie. And then they entangle their bodies, and there is this very startling, what like I think must be an intentional like kind of visual quote and like recontextualization of a very famous shot from the beginning of Ghost in the Shell, which is in Ghost in the Shell, it's the Major in like sort of like sitting in a window well framed against the city, and it's just basically her silhouette, with her like being very starkly, dramatically alone, and the window well is like surrounded by darkness. So it is this like very sharp point of like rectangular light with the silhouette of the main character in the middle of it, and the majority of the frame being totally in black. And it's a very striking, very famous image from that movie that is meant to sort of give you that sense of like distinct isolation that the Major feels. They do a very similar shot here where it is them on the bed framed like it's a window well in the middle of the frame, and then a bunch of like black around it. But instead of them being alone, it is them entangled in each other. And then it does this interesting thing where this shot like zooms out and like snap zoom outs like repeatedly to it being this very small frame about the size of the shot in Ghost in the Shell by the end of it. And it is a cool, like, there's obviously a lot of Ghost in the Shell influence in all of the Matrix stuff. But that is like the most like direct, this is like them quoting a shot from that movie. but recontextualizing it to be the opposite of what it signified in that film. Where that film, it was this like very harsh, brutal social isolation, and here it is this like sense of intimate connection that does come with a sense of broader dread of like the fear of death, like imminent for Trinity in the future. But that shot really stood out to me watching the movie.
And I think the other side of that shot is it's all of the like holes in their body from the Matrix process. It's this line of, because I think you're specifically looking at Neo's back, and it's just a big row of along his spine, the like different like cord holes, the like ports in his body, USB-D or whatever they are, and it's fascinating. I think it's a beautiful shot, and obviously that too is inflected by Ghost in the Shell, which is the mix of the robot and the organic body. But yeah, and I think like, you're talking about like showing an actual like sex act to completion. The way that's usually done in Hollywood movies, if it is done at all, is you have the guy on top of the woman thrusts like 3 times and then it's over. And usually you just go, and there's no focus at all on like the woman's pleasure or anything like that. And it's not like, it's a full like sex scene where you have because I also think the music in that sequence is brilliant, and the way it is all cut together, and it is using slow motion and all of these like different sort of speed ramping techniques, and so there is this like rhythm to it. There's this like actual like sexual embodied rhythm to the actual edit of the scene, to the way it is cutting and doing these visual matches between Neo and Trinity having sex, and then the bodies like kind of grinding against each other in the rave scene, and it is extending this sort of sexual energy throughout the entire society, and then embodying it in Neo and Trinity. And I just think it is a remarkably well put together scene. And if you know anything about the Wachowskis' later work, like it is a very clear precursor to stuff they do in Cloud Atlas and in Sense8 and in some of their other stuff. Which I actually think is in general true of The Matrix Reloaded. The Matrix Reloaded kind of feels like a sample platter of everything they're going to do for the rest of their career. Like pretty much every big idea and technical sort of thing they're going to attempt in their later work is indicated in this movie, from Speed Racer to Sense8. And I think that's an interesting thing that's going on in this film as well.
Yeah, and one piece in the midst of all of that too is I think it is very like distinct that Morpheus is not participant in any of this, right? Like there's some brief flirting between him and Niobe that is then shot down by the general character
Locke.
Yeah, by Locke. And then Morpheus, goes home and he's like the one person who doesn't get laid, basically, right? You have a later shot of him like alone in his apartment. And I think that like, especially then with the end of the movie, I think it's very intentional that one of the mistakes that Morpheus makes is that he's too chaste or whatever. He's too priestly, and he's bought too much into the faith and too much into the religion. And that has kind of like removed him from like the sensual embodied experiences of like all the people that he's trying to like motivate and lead.
Yeah, he's a great leader who's a little lost in and of himself, because they even give that indication that like the whole thing with Niobe, they have the line, I think Trinity says, he went to see the Oracle and then nothing was the same. And I like that little suggestion that like Morpheus changed at some point, and that this movie is also kind of interrogating that the things that made us love Morpheus so much in the first movie, they're not bad things about him, but they do blind him to certain things. Like, he is a deeply good person, but he is not someone who is all-knowing, which he kind of seemed like he maybe was in the first movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is important to the entire arc of this film and the next one, because what happens on the opposite end of this movie is that Neo is, as we learn, the 6th one, and he is the one who makes a different choice, and he makes a different choice specifically because of Trinity, but that is a stand-in for all that other stuff. Neo is the person with a more holistic like understanding of the things being fought for. It is more embodied for him, and that embodiment is the thing that connects it all back. And I think it is an interesting that, I bet if you time it, they're probably on exact opposite ends of the movie, the architect scene and the Zion rave. And the Zion rave is like hot and sweaty and embodied and like very carnal, and like it is all these like rich, like warm colors. And the architect scene is intentionally as sterile as it can possibly be, And there's obviously a big contrast going on there.
Although, but then also the architect himself with his like whole Colonel Sanders look. I mean, he's the sexiest character in the whole movie, if you ask me.
Yes. That's because they have, if you weren't around for the time, the big KFC tie-in for Matrix Reloaded was crazy, where they just replaced Colonel Sanders with the architect. That didn't happen. Hope we're not actually tricking any younger listeners here, but yeah. Now I'm imagining that, and that would be very funny.
Just like it would be the worst sales pitch ever. It's just you have that dude and he's just talking into the camera in a very monotone voice about like the necessity of chicken to fuel like the cells of the human body. You like silly, stupid ape creatures. He's just
apropos of your hunger, we have made a bucket of 12 pieces of chicken.
The flawed construction of the human organism demands that it is fueled periodically with nutrients. Ergo, we are going to give you some fried chicken.
Man, why isn't marketing ever as fun as we want it to be, Sean?
Yeah.
I mean, because it would fail, but also, put us in charge of a marketing agency for a year. We will drive it into the ground, but we will have fun along the way.
It would be a great commercial.
Great commercial. All right. I also do love there's this little scene between Neo and the counselor when Neo wakes up in the middle of the night and he walks out and you have him talking to the counselor and they go down into the engineering deck and there's the whole and then this kind of kicks off the whole like free will versus choice debate in the movie where they're talking about that Zion is also reliant upon machines and says we're kind of plugged in, and Neo says, nah, that's stupid, we could turn off these machines, and the counselor says, well, we could, but we'd all die, basically, and is sort of questioning Neo's absolutist view of free will here, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, and it is like Neo does come across as a bit of an idiot in that scene. Yes. I mean, it, like intentionally, but it is very funny. It's just like, what are you talking about? We control these machines. We could just turn these machines off, and you just get this like the counselor's like, oh, this fucking blockhead. Like you really not. It's like, yeah, we could turn them off. We could also all die. But yes, that I love that scene because it does set up. As I said, like kind of at the top of this discussion, there is this like repeated encounter that Neo has with these different figures that then kind of talk to him about the nature of like free will and choice. And the counselors, I think, is one of my favorites because he has this great line where Neo's like says like, what is this? So you're saying that like we're as reliant as the machines are reliant on us. Is that your point? And he says like, I don't have a point. Old men don't make points. And there's something very elegant about this sort of. It doesn't need to have a point. Like he's just making an observation, right? And so much of the movie is about like what is the point of anything, right? Like what is the why, the purpose that Smith is seeking so much, and Neo is repeatedly told that it's like it doesn't matter what you're doing or whether you have control over what you're doing because you don't. But it's like what is important is the why, and that is both what the Merovingian and the Oracle tells him. And I like that that's sort of seated in this slightly sort of like Socrates-esque way with the counselor at the beginning of this movie of him saying he doesn't have a point. He's just making an observation about how much are they actually in control, and then conversely, how much are the machines in control because they too are reliant on the humans to continue being whatever the fuck the machines want to be.
Absolutely. And I think I just love the way that actor plays it. I think there is a very Socrates-esque... Like, you could imagine if someone were making a Socrates biopic, you would cast that guy or something, right? There's a very, like, that kind of feeling to it of the teacher figure. I also love his line, I figured that I slept for the first 11 years of my life, now I'm making up for it. The whole idea that he doesn't sleep because he's in the real world now. That's a beautiful little line. And just, again, seeing more of Zion. And I also think this scene is a good corrective to a danger of a plot like The Matrix in like being complete like techno-nihilism, right? Of like, there would be a danger, I think, from the first movie of just being like technology is evil and bad. And that's not the point of any of the Matrix movies, really, right? Because the technology is just a tool, and there are like bigger systems going on, and the system is actually what's wrong, not the technology, is obviously a major point of the entire trilogy. Yeah.
There's a point that's made in that scene as well about the willful ignorance of people, right? That like these are the machines that they're on top of are the things that are keeping everybody alive, and the vast majority of the people that live in that society have no idea how any of that shit works. They don't care how it works, they care that it works, right? And that's another, like, what separates Neo, or what separates, like, the hero of this story is the search for, like, the reason why, not just the what is it, or that, but it's like, why is this thing, like, how does it function, like, what is, like, the deeper purpose and mechanisms underlying everything, and that is also set up in this, like, early conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all good stuff. I like this. One last note about the Zion section. This is a character we will come to know much better in the next movie. Played by Nathaniel Lees is Captain Mifune. They call him Mifune, but I do love that there's a character named after Toshiro Mifune in this movie. Yes. And in the next movie, he is one of the best characters in the whole trilogy. He has like 2 scenes here, but I wanted to call that out because that's one of their like name references that's very obvious, but I do love it.
Yes, yeah. As soon as I did not remember that at all, and then as soon as they said it, I'm like, okay, yep, I have learned who that person is since the last time I watched this movie.
Yeah, that's a good point. Last time, I know, like when we were kids, we would have had no idea because we hadn't seen like a bunch of Kurosawa films. So anyway, that's cool. All right, then the next stretch of the movie is Neo going to meet the Oracle. I do love in this stretch of the movie, first off, you meet Seraph, and I do like Seraph. Yes. Seraph is cool. This is what I mean about the action in this movie. Seraph and Neo's fight is like the 6th most complicated fight scene in the movie, and it would be like the best martial arts scene in most like Hollywood action movies, you know?
Yeah. Like, I mean, I'm going to tell you right now, I think it's the best action scene in this movie because it's the one that has like the most narrative and like character momentum behind it, and I like that it's like it's way more grounded. It's more in the style of the original Matrix movie. They don't kind of go as over the top with it, and it also is nice to have like Colin Cho is like who plays Seraph is an actual martial artist who's been in a lot of Hong Kong action movies, most notably being Donnie Yen's Wilson Yip's Flashpoint starring Donnie Yen, and like his physicality is so powerful in that scene because it's like he really knows what the fuck he's doing.
Oh, it's great. I mean, it's the one that feels the most like something out of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is what the choreographer on these movies also worked on that movie. And it's just like the set and the choreography of it all. But it's phenomenal. Like, it's, there's one shot. I mean, the whole thing is just shot so well, and like it's so well choreographed. But there's this one shot that starts down on their feet and showing like their feet moving against each other. And in most Hollywood movies, I would kind of roll my eyes at that and go, oh, they're doing the shot down on the feet because they don't actually have actors who can do this because, so we're subdividing the body. So that's like what happens with like modern musicals and dancing too also. But then what that shot does is it starts on their feet and then it pans up and shows their full bodies. That is a fucking cool shot to do it that way. Because, like, that's kind of like this is real, assholes. Like, look at this. This is so cool. And it's a great little fight scene. And, I love that it's almost like a throwaway in the movie, but it's just so good. It's, that kind of stuff is awesome.
Yeah, it's just this kind of like classic Hong Kong martial arts kind of like you have to fight this dude in order to go, talk to the person you're trying to talk to. So there's not any actual animosity between Neo and Seraph. It's a test for him. Yes. But it's just like so perfectly shot, like perfectly constructed, incredibly well performed. Like it's just like a little gem of a very cool martial arts scene in this movie. That like has always stood out to me. Like I've always really loved Seraph's role in this movie, and that's like I didn't realize how much until I also realized like this is the dude who like I keep on saying Flashpoint, but the 8-minute action scene at the end of that movie is like legitimately one of the best martial arts scenes I've ever seen. So particularly if you want to see something that is very like MMA inflected, people should just watch that scene because it's fucking great, and this dude's amazing in it.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. So, I was just Googling Flashpoint, and all I can find are about the fucking Justice League shit. Okay.
Yeah, Google Flashpoint, and then put in that same search Donnie Yen, and then you will find the movie you need.
I'm like getting the Flashpoint paradox is the new Flash, a Flashpoint movie, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, I want the good thing.
Yes.
All right.
I want the thing where Donnie Yen suplexes a man through a fucking table, please. Thank you.
Oh, my God. All right. Anywho, so... let's see. Then we have the scene with the Oracle, in between there, the way they get to the oracles, they introduce the idea of the back doors in the Matrix. I do love stuff like that. One of the things I like in this movie is it sort of like makes the Matrix itself more malleable through the stuff like the back doors and all of that. And there's some of that stuff that I think is cool.
Yes, yeah, it's just like extra little world building that makes sense of like reminding you that the Matrix is a sort of constructed reality by the machine, so it doesn't have to obey the rules of the actual world. You can have a little weird secret hallway that just connects to anywhere else in the world.
All right, and then we have this movie's big scene with the Oracle, played once again by Gloria Foster. I forgot her last name for a second. And this one is kind of even meatier and bigger than the scene in the first movie. There's a lot going on in this scene. It obviously plays off of, like, when you watch it knowing the architect scene at the end, it plays very differently. But it's a really interesting scene.
Yeah, this is where, like, they confirm definitively that the Oracle is a program. And this is where, like, one thing I like about the Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions is one of the ways they expand the world building is, like, definitively confirming that the agents are not the only, like, conscious entities that exist within the Matrix that are non-human, right? And so the Oracle and Seraph, the Keymaker, the Merovingian, and his like lackeys, Persephone, and then of course the Architect at the end. Like all of these are programs who we like read as being conscious, independent entities. Although how much of that is like true to their actual existence is I suppose to be up to debate. But like that is a dynamic that I really love of that you have assumed the Oracle was maybe a human in the first movie or like was some sort of weird existence you don't know, and the fact that she's like definitively a part of the Matrix created by the machines, like is one of those ways where it is like breaking up things that you sort of assume about the first movie and complicating them, where as Neo is in the scene, you're not sure how much you can trust the Oracle and what she's doing or what she's saying or what her like real objectives are.
Exactly. You know, this is something I love about both this and the next movie is sort of fleshing out the machine world as its own culture. Yeah. And you don't see a ton of it by design. But you get these glimpses into it and you realize that like the machines and the programs and however you want to define it, they are their own society and their own world, and they have their own rules, and they have their own like criminals and runaways. The way that the Oracle explains it to us is that there are programs everywhere, and there are some that go rogue. And then I do love this explanation that like all of the monsters that we have myths about, like ghosts and angels and vampires and aliens, are the system assimilating something that's doing what it's not supposed to. And so there are all these like runaway programs that are supposed to go return to the source that are just out running around the Matrix. And there's just suggestions like that the Merovingian is our clearest window into it, and even then that's still at like an arm's length remove. And I just love that the movie suggests all of that. And then when you get like, there's that one moment where the Architect cracks at the end and he says, there are levels of survival we are prepared to accept, and he looks scared. And you get a little of this in Matrix Revolutions when we get to Machine City, but that there is an entire other movie to be made that we probably couldn't make because we can't imagine how they would think and move and act. But there's a whole alternate trilogy of the machines doing their shit. And and I like that it also keeps it at a remove where we clearly couldn't fully understand them, you know?
Yeah, that like the only way we can understand them is like as embodied as human personalities that you interact with directly in the Matrix. But like how that relates to their existence and how they perceive themselves in their world is it's like a fascinating thing to try to comprehend. That it's a much more elaborate version of like those little morsels you got in the first movie from Agent Smith of like him testing humans and the smell of them and all that kind of stuff. And there is like a very powerful notion of that the machines are not perfect, right? They're far from perfect. Like they create programs that then are outdated, but those programs seem to like have a sense of sort of like self-worth and self-value enough that they don't want to be deleted or destroyed. So they escape into the Matrix as these weird sort of like rogue elements that are also hiding, you know, from the agents, right? Like when in the big freeway scene, the agents are more interested in getting the Keymaker and not in getting Trinity and Morpheus as like a whatever. They want to retrieve the Keymaker as a sort of like rogue programmed entity. and all of that stuff. It's so evocative and suggests this much larger world that is so interesting. And as you say, it's something you could never explore fully, because if you even if you tried to, it would be disappointing, because you'd have to collapse this like sort of like fascinating infinite range of possibilities about how that world would work into something that could be easily understood by human brains. And so I think it's the perfect amount of like evocative elements and then distance from it to let you kind of fill in the rest of the gaps yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And Revolutions will do this as well, and it is something I generally like about the direction of the sequels, is that the Wachowskis' vision of how to end the Matrix story and resolve the war is not destroying all the machines. I think that is a much more interesting direction for the entire story, and just like little spoiler for Revolutions, like that's not this Revolutions is not Neo and Trinity go to Machine City with a nuke like to destroy it all or something. It's a very different vision of how this will work, because the other revelation of the movie is that Neo is also a program. Like that's like, or like partially a program. Like that is part of something that I actually think a lot of people don't realize the architect is saying that, but it's very important to the structure of the movies. And I love all of that. But also, like, then there's the Oracle, who is on one level seemingly the like kindest and most trustworthy character in the movie, and now we have this, Neo has to ask, like, can I trust you? And her answers are obviously very elliptic and all of that, and then she introduces this idea of the choice having already been made, and what is important is having to understand the choice. And I think all of the things that are being introduced here are so thorny. And it feels like the best version of the Oracle, where on one level she does give Neo like literal instructions, like go meet the Merovingian here, but what the purpose of that meeting is like planting these seeds in his head that are going to take 2 movies to figure out.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that, so the last episode of the podcast we recorded was the episode 401 where we did the interview thing, and one of the questions I asked you was, do you believe in free will? Not remembering at all that is like entirely what this movie is about, because what the Oracle says here about, like, you didn't come here to make the choice, you've already made it, you're here to try to understand why you made it. And like the Merovingian like kind of goes into more detail about what the Oracle talks about here, which is like one of the notions of that you don't have free will is that like the conscious entity that you understand yourself to be, like the personality, the persona, whatever that you sort of like think of as yourself, that we like to think of that thing as being in the driver's seat. That is like, I am Sean Chapman, I am like a conscious, thoughtful entity, and I have the ability to choose what it is I do, that this thought I'm having is the driver's seat. But the argument for that you don't have free will is that conscious entity is not the thing that's in the driver's seat. It is a sort of projection by the actual thing that's in the driver's seat, which is this sort of a more unconscious part of your brain that you are receiving all the input of like external stimuli that you can, or internal stimuli, and however you would want to frame things like hunger, sexual desire, things like that. But then also like the culture you're built up in, like the things that you are taught, the systems you live within, all these things create something within you that then in response to certain stimuli is going to create certain decisions that then you as the conscious entity are not actually making. You're just responding to the choices that your body or this other like part of your brain has already chosen to make. And you have to be aware that that is happening and try to explore the reasons why is like the best that you can do. That's sort of part of the concept that you don't have free will. That part of you has already made the choice. And that part is not the thinking part, is like the emotion part, is the core part of you. And your conscious entity is just like a thing that is along the ride of this more emotional, intuitive part of your like being that is just responding to external stimuli the same way that a single-celled organism responds to external stimuli in its environment and is not consciously aware of why it is choosing to eat or attack certain things. It's just doing it. And so some of those are like the ideas that the Oracle and then the Merovingian scene is playing with, like putting those ideas in this sort of like shell of like programming and things like that to sort of translate it into the Matrix's language.
And this is where I find the structure of the 2 sequels so complementary and interesting, because what Reloaded is doing is it is going through the entire arc of the one as it's programmed to happen. We finish the story that is laid out in the first Matrix movie in the second movie. Like, all of the prophecy, all of that side of the movie that is, like, laid out, that I think if you were to ask someone at the end of Matrix 1, how will this story eventually end? Well, it'll have to end with the prophecy of the one being fulfilled, right? Mm-hmm. And it is, but it's fulfilled at the end of the second movie, not the third. And so the second movie is about moving through the entire sort of game as it's laid out to be played, and realizing that that whole side of it is kind of besides the point, because it is predetermined, that all of those steps along the way, all of the action they have to go through, all of the things that are going to happen there are sort of not the characters making conscious choices. It's doing what they're reacting to, even up to the big quote-unquote choice at the end of the movie, which is that the architect gives Neo 2 doors, and I don't think the camera even shows us the other door, because it is such an obvious, like, Neo's not going to walk through the door where Trinity dies. And the architect knows that, and he knows it, and there's no, like... And so it very much comes back to what the Oracle is saying about the choice being less important than the understanding of it. And then what we are left with at the end of this movie is a third film where we've moved past those pre-programmed choices, and we are now on a path that is more difficult and contingent and not predetermined. And that's sort of and that's why the last movie is called Revolutions. Like, there's a very clear arc going on here that I think is really interesting and subversive in interesting ways, because it is actualizing some of its thoughts on free will.
Yeah. I think one of the things that then does become thorny about it, this is something we talked about in my question to you on the last podcast about whether or not free will exists, is that if you're trying to dramatize this element, there's a difficulty with the answer to the question whether or not you have free will is irrelevant, right? Because if you don't have free will, there's nothing you can do about it. And if you do have free will, then good for you. But it is definitely like a thing of where if you're trying to dramatize this idea of like you're being programmed, you're just following like the steps that are laid for you, that you don't have the conscious choice and you're not making conscious choices and you're just responding to the stimuli in your environment. Like, it is definitely like a very anti-narrative concept. Because like narratives are fundamentally about characters making choices, right? Or like that's traditionally what you think your stories are about, is characters being presented with some sort of dilemma, some sort of choice, or like multiple choices over the course of the story. You know, it's like the hero refusing the call to action and then having to ultimately make it. Those sorts of things are where we traditionally find meaning within stories. And The Matrix Reloaded is like, I don't think it's like holistically rejecting that, because, well, as you say, there is a third movie where presumably they posit that to some extent, perhaps there is some level of free choice. Well, I'll have to visit that when we watch the third movie, because I don't remember.
I think it's thorny, but I think the point is, I think it's about reframing the question, and I think that's what the movie does interestingly with the Oracle scene, is the choice becomes less important than the understanding of, like, the things underneath it. And I think that's why, like, I mean, a lot of Reloaded is about characters fighting against things that they will accept in the third movie. Like, Neo gets the hand of Smith in the chest to assimilate him 53 minutes into this movie, and that is ultimately the end point of the Matrix trilogy, is him letting it happen. You know, he is fighting this whole movie against Trinity dying. Trinity fucking dies in Revolutions, and it is brutal and, like, uncompromising. Like, that's where I think there's this, like, I think the movie's relationship to it is thorny, but in productive and interesting ways, I guess, is my view on it.
Yeah, I think the difficulty I have with it is within this movie, once you start introducing these concepts, it then makes a lot of the action scenes not that interesting to me, right? Because the action scenes don't have anything to do with this, really. Like, they don't, because I don't know how you would make an action scene without, like, I think you could conceptualize it, but it would have to basically be farcical. And I think there are elements of farce, like, I think very much intentionally in the Merovingian. I don't know how intentional the elements of farce of the Burly Brawl are. But it doesn't lean into it all the way. And so I think this is where the movie both starts to, like, interest me the most, because I find these ideas very interesting, but then also it starts kind of laying its own path of, like, sort of disinterest for me in, like, I don't see what the like action scene that immediately follows this, and then like the very big action scene on the freeway, how those really connect to any of these concepts at all. And it's because like they've decided to tackle themes that I think are much more difficult to try to actualize through strongly motivated character action, which is exciting and big action sequences, compared to the first movie where its themes are very easy to make very compelling and expressed through big, interesting, well choreographed action scenes. And this is where I think like the movie starts to me run into some difficulties in how do you fuse this with the like aesthetic stylings of Matrix action. For me, I don't think the movie succeeds in that question.
That's a really interesting point and a way of framing it. And it makes me really curious, Sean, how you are going to react to seeing Revolutions again. Because Revolutions, and I think one of the things that people have always pushed back on with that movie, is it is very bleak and it is very kind of overwhelming. But I do think that movie's vision of action is much more like consciously married to the themes of the movie, in that all of the action, and especially the stuff that happens in Zion in Revolutions, is about fighting against something inevitable and like fighting against something that cannot actually be stopped. It's about fighting against death. Mm-hmm. And like I think that's why it works, is I think it's a very actualized version of that. I also understand why it's been off-putting to some people because it is a bleak movie. But yeah, because you're right. But it's an interesting question because I don't know what the answer to that is. This isn't one where I can say like with the problem with the Sentinels at the beginning of the movie, we can say, oh, there just should have been a scene where we see the Sentinels, right? I don't know what the answer is to, we're going to make a movie about free will and then we need to have action scenes. Like, that's really hard to try to figure out what the alternative is, you know?
Yeah, I think you could do it, but I don't know if like the Matrix actually has like the cinematic language to do it, I guess.
Right.
Like with the style of action they do, it just doesn't have like the space to do it within its own film. So it's something of where I think like the movie is biting off more than it can really chew, which is admirable, but also then there's like 40 minutes of action scenes that like, to me, I just don't find that ultimately compelling. Like I find compelling some of it in an abstract sense, but in like my investment in the story being told, I don't find it that interesting.
Yeah. So after the Oracle scene, we have the Smith and Neo scene, which is Agent Smith's biggest scene in this movie, where he gives the whole speech about them having a connection now. But after the last movie, Smith was supposed to go back to the mainframe, but instead he stayed in the Matrix. He's broken the rules. He's disobeyed. He says, because of you, I am no longer an agent of this system. Because of you, I've changed. I'm unplugged. And so what they set up, and I love this side of the movie, what they set up is Smith as like dark Neo. He is also a rebel. He is also someone who has broken free of the system, but he has done it in a like completely different way. He's like a dark mirror almost of like the boy in Zion that Neo freed, because Neo also freed Smith, but in freeing Smith he becomes like the opposite of Neo, these two beings who have broken free from the system, and then Smith brings in the idea of purpose, and in his search for purpose he is just assimilating everything, and then of course that leads us into the Burly Brawl.
Well, in fact, I would actually push back against some of what you just said, Jonathan, because Neo hasn't broken free from the system. He is a part of the system.
That's true.
Like,
that's true. Yeah.
He is fulfilling his role in the system more right now than he was, arguably, when he was just Mr. Anderson in his office.
That's a good point.
Smith is the actual person who has broken free. He is the actual rogue, chaotic element, which is always like the thing that, like, when I talked about in the last podcast of like, I'm really excited to revisit where this character goes in the future movies because of this dynamic. Because in the first movie, you are led to believe, because of the story that movie tells, that Neo has broken free, when in actuality, the thing he has done in killing Agent Smith is freed him and created something that, like, you in this movie, you very much don't know what the fuck he is. But he is more free than any other character that we have encountered so far.
Yes, and I think that's a good, because I guess and this is where I think Reloaded is so interesting and challenging the audience, is Neo is free in the sense that he's broken out of the Matrix, and that's what I meant. Like, Neo he's no longer plugged into the Matrix, he can fly, he is free in those senses, but of course you're right, we've already learned in the Oracle scene just now, and we're going to learn very clearly in the Architect scene, that Neo is playing to a script that was laid out to him, right?
Yeah.
Like all of that is very on rails, and so I think Neo probably thinks he has broken out, but he hasn't. Neo thinks he has free will, but he doesn't. And Smith is the one who is embodying actual freedom, and it is this like, this is where it gets, I think, a little psychoanalytic in his like expansion of the ego to all these other bodies. Like his freedom is this like untrammeled ego that just feeds and consumes and goes and takes over, you know?
Yeah, and that his freedom also seems to have driven him insane, right? Because this is where he gives his like purpose speech, that is purpose that creates us, purpose that connects us, blah 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 blah, and all of that. But of course, like by having been freed, he doesn't really have a purpose, right? It's like the best he can come up with is we're here to take from you what you tried to take from us. Purpose. Like the best thing he can come up with to do is like petty revenge, basically, because he's free from the system. Like, what is he to do? And he's like lost, I think, is like where that character is, and I find that very interesting. And as you say, like he is sort of monstrously expanding himself to consume the rest of the Matrix, because he is freed from like the boundaries that have been put on him in a much more sort of like frightening way than you could arguably say was for Neo with his ability to like do Superman shit. What Agent Smith is doing is terrifying. Like he's able to take over people's consciousness and exist in the real world in some way, which you only get little bits and pieces of in this movie.
Yeah, it's. I mean, most of this is going to be paid off in the next movie, so I don't even know how much we should talk about it. But like, it's where you do see that these two movies were made together, because like all of the ideas are being laid out. Like I said, we're not even an hour into part 2, and Neo is confronted with the thing that he will eventually accept at the end of part 3, which is Smith putting the hand in and trying to assimilate him. Nope, that's not what I meant to say. Assimilate.
There's some psychoanalysis for you.
Yep. I mean, kind of. I guess he is kind of inseminating him.
Yes.
But I meant to say assimilate. And then, of course, you have Smith starting this refrain of saying, it is inevitable. And he's saying that over and over again. And to a degree, he's right. Because if we want to put it in the Oracle's terms, Neo has sort of already made the choice. It's just going to take 2 movies for him to understand it. My biggest laugh in this entire movie is when there's the other agent who comes in and is like, oh, fuck, this Smith guy. And then Smith comes up and assimilates him. And then the new Agent Smith looks at the other Agent Smith and says, you. And Smith says, yes, me. Me. And then the other guy goes, me too. Yep. It's so... Hugo Weaving is having so much fun. And I fucking love him. I love that beautiful man. He's great.
Yes, I love how he's got the big sunglasses covering his eyes, and somehow you can still see how hard that man's eyebrows are working on with his acting, right? Like you can barely even see the eyebrows. It's like the amount of acting those eyebrows are doing is just incredible.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah. Love Agent Smith, love all of that. And then we do get the Burly Brawl, one of the only action sequences in movie history that just has a fully known, agreed upon moniker, because that's what they called it through all of production. That's the song on the soundtrack. It's just because if you go through the production history of this movie, this was the biggest. The Wachowskis came up with a crazy idea, and then effects artists and everyone working on the movie had to figure out, how do you do that? Because at the time that they started making Matrix Reloaded, this idea was impossible. And by the end, they had figured it out, and I do think this action sequence, I love it. I think it's phenomenal. I think it's one of the best in all the trilogy. I also think it is technically and technologically worth studying, because it is creating a bunch of ideas that are now, kind of commonplace, but this is the first place you kind of see them in movie history.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something that might be controversial here. I don't actually like this fight that much. I respect the technological innovation, but there's a lot of stuff. I like some of the opening of this fight, and I think once this fight starts getting crazy, I lose sense of what the intention of the fight scene is. I don't know how dumb the fight scene is supposed to be, because it is phenomenally stupid. It is, unbelievably stupid.
It's so fun. It's so fun. It's so cool.
But to, this is part of my, to what end? What is this fight scene doing?
Because there is no end. That's like the point. His only actual... The fighting is completely useless and stupid that Neo is doing. His only actual answer is to run away. And in the end, in the next movie, the actual answer is, you can't fight this thing.
But that, to me, it's just not a good motivation for, like, the amount of like, stuff that goes into this fight. And then, like, really, I think my problem with this fight is that I think, like, while, like, the technical innovation is really admirable, for me, it doesn't work. There are, like, two very separate realities that exist in this fight. There's a reality where you have actors, and there's a reality where everything is digital, and they are completely different in style, in look, in choreography, in the way they are shot, right? And so again, this is like, it is a very innovative fight in terms of what it is trying to do with technology, but part of the thing is that this is where they sort of innovate on the idea of having like the virtual camera that can shoot like virtual things that look to a certain extent like live action, certainly like more than anything had been before. The problem is that a virtual camera is not bound by the physical laws and rules that an actual physical camera is, but you are still shooting most of the fight with a physical camera. There are only certain sequences that are done with the digital camera. And the digital camera looks completely unlike the physical one in every single way, and it completely takes me out of the fight, especially when it is contrasted with this really elegant, really beautifully put together fight of Neo fighting Seraph. And it's so much more interesting to me than, like, this very messy, all over the place thing they do with the Burly Brawl that feels like the Wachowskis wanting to do an anime fight scene, but they can't do an anime fight scene because they're shooting a live action movie. And I just wish it was just like a 2D animated sequence or something, because it could have executed on the ideas it wanted to do. Instead, you get this like weird mess of like trying to throw everything at the wall to try to communicate the idea of Neo with superpowers fighting an army of Agent Smiths. And it's like so desperate to communicate that idea that I don't think it ever really does it effectively.
Oh, I profoundly disagree here. I think what it's doing is fascinating. And I think there's obviously, and it's going to get worse as time goes by, the CGI is very clearly CGI, and there's no getting around that. And it's 2003, and it's going to look more dated with time, obviously. And it probably did not look completely real when it came out.
I'm going to go on the record. I've always thought the Burly Brawl was a dumb, bad fight. So this is not a new opinion. Okay. I have always felt this about this.
Yeah. But you get what I'm saying, that like,
yes.
It's there is a little bit of a shock of like, this is older CGI. But I think the mix between the physical camera and we need to be careful here. It's not a digital camera. It's a virtual camera.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a digital camera in the sense that like it is, but we have another term that we use that for. So yes.
Yes.
It's a virtual
digital camera is just a physical camera that shoots to digital stock, not film stock. Virtual camera meaning it is not a real thing. It is a thing in a virtual space. And I think this is a really well boarded and choreographed fight in where it chooses to take those moments and those leaps into the virtual space, and how that communicates that to me, like, no, I guess I see what you mean about they don't look the same, but what they're communicating are different things. Like when Neo is going, it's when Neo does the most like super powered stuff in this fight, and the most sort of, it's literally breaking out of, you're building up through things that you can do with a physical camera in physical space, and then you are exploding into like things that are so crazy to show that you have to have a virtual camera in this space to do it, like him doing the pole and running around and kicking like the 50 Agent Smiths that are coming at him, and I love that shot. And there's just a lot of things like that I just, there's a technical side of it that I find very virtuosic, and I do think it's put together really interestingly. And I do think the Wachowskis, especially in this period of their work, are like really invested in figuring out, can you take some of these anime visual codes and adapt them to live action? And maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is maybe. Speed Racer certainly is like very invested in this and goes for sort of a full virtual camera sort of thing. But I just find it very compelling, and I do find it to be an interesting fight sequence, and and I think it is an interesting blend of the old and new, in that, like, sometimes it's very clearly Hugo Weaving, but then a lot of the bodies are not him, they're stunt doubles, and if you look closely, especially on the 4K Blu-ray, you can tell that like Hugo Weaving is fairly easy to double for because of the haircut and the suit and the sunglasses, but you can still tell it's a lot of people dressed up like Hugo Weaving, and then it is a CGI double of Hugo Weaving, and there are sort of the two Keanu Reeves in the sequence. I find it interesting, and I find it compelling as a fight in the movie too, because I do think it's an interesting setup to some of what the next movie is going to pay off. But I understand where you're coming from. I guess this is just one where I kind of diametrically disagree.
Yeah, I think one of like the lessons that filmmakers learned is that like even if you have a virtual camera, if your movie's not shot entirely with a virtual camera and is this like not trying to use that language consistently, like I think you need to have the virtual camera obey the laws that a physical camera would do, but you can still do that and still get shots that you would never be able to get with an actual physical camera. But there's certain laws of like physical laws of momentum and things like that a physical camera will obey to a certain degree that like a virtual camera needs to replicate to a certain extent, or to me it just like completely takes me out of it, and it just lose the sense of like the story. I lose the sense of the characters. I lose the sense of like the reality of the film, and I think it's like too haphazard with how it switches between those two styles, and the virtual style to me is so utterly unconvincing that I would much rather have what might be like a much more pared down action scene, but was one that you just did in the style of previous Matrix 1-to-1 action scenes. And it's like, is it pretty obvious that this is a bunch of like stunt doubles wearing glasses in like black suits? Yes, but to me, I find that more honest and more like true to the rest of the style of the movie than all of a sudden here's this like completely ridiculous shot where like all sense of physics and momentum and weight and cloth and skin and all that stuff just becomes so completely artificial. And there are a couple of shots in the freeway scene with Morpheus that do the same thing, and it's just like, to me, it just takes me out of the movie completely. And I wish that they just went for a more consistent style. Either having the entire fight just be completely ridiculous virtual stuff might have actually worked better than switching between it with those shots. Like it just, to me, there's so much dissonance in the aesthetic of what they're going for that it just doesn't work.
I guess I also disagree that there's no sense of momentum to some of that. I think the camera feels very embodied in a lot of what it's doing. And this is not the only scene that does virtual camera work. There's also some of the stuff at the beginning with Trinity's assault on the complex. You have several like big shots in the movie that do like basically big sweeping camera movements that couldn't possibly be done in reality. But I do think I don't agree that it like just completely disobeys laws of momentum and physics. I think there's some stuff, and I mean, partially if it is, it's also happening in the Matrix, so that's kind of the point. But like, I don't know, I'm okay with that. I don't have those same problems with it, and this is weird because I'm very, very rarely the person ever arguing for like CGI effects. But I think it's interesting, and I think it is like an interesting precursor to stuff like Gravity, the Alfonso Cuarón movie, or which is probably the most notable movie that's won Best Cinematography despite not really being shot with a camera. It's an interesting like early version of some of that stuff, and maybe it's more of a curio, but I don't feel that way. So
yeah, it's never really worked for me. And part of it is also there is a very like slapsticky element to it that like is always weird to me because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the Matrix. Like the most slapstick thing being there's a shot where Neo throws one Agent Smith into a bunch of other Agent Smiths and a bowling pin sound effect plays.
It's fucking great. I love it.
And it is funny, but it's also just like, it's weird. Like I just like am not entirely sure what is being expressed in the scene to me. I just am kind of left a little befuddled by it.
Well, you want to move on and talk about the Merovingian making a random woman come with a piece of chocolate cake?
Yes, things that are totally explicable. Let's move to that.
Yes. Well, Sean, tell me what you think of the our friend the Merovingian.
I love this scene. I love this whole sequence of the movie of like, this is where I think this whole sequence is like very intentionally farcical. Like this is where I think the play on like free will and choice is the most interesting to me, because the Merovingian doesn't actually tell us anything new. all he's doing is telling us in more detail the exact same things the Oracle was saying, like to the point where he almost quotes her directly about it's the why, like the why is what separates us, and he phrases it almost identically to the Oracle, and he's going on about all that shit. But then, of course, as the sequence fully plays out, you then have him being betrayed by Persephone, his wife, and there's a whole bunch of like Greek mythology shit that we don't need to get into, but there's all that shit's there too. Her sort of betraying him, and then him coming in and being surprised, and her giving the same line about like cause and effect, it's causality, right? All that shit, and him being like, and it's this hilarious thing of where like, because nobody has free will, because like all these things are just like this series of dominoes that you start with the Merovingian thinking that he knows everything that's going on, but he's just another domino in the series of dominoes that he is describing. He is not any more aware of it actually than anybody else is. There's something about like the broad comedy of that whole sequence that really plays very well to me, and how it is like dramatizing something very effectively about what like the themes about free will that the movie is exploring.
Yes, I think that's very true, because the Merovingian, who's played by this guy Lambert Wilson, who I don't think I've ever seen in anything else. I do love him here. I think because basically the assignment is crazy cartoon Frenchman. Like, it is so over the top and silly, and I love it. And his whole argument during the restaurant scene is that it's not about free will, it's about power, right? And he is completely unaware that him being a fucking dick, crazy cartoon Frenchman is the thing that is causing Persephone over here to want to rebel and fuck him over. And so he doesn't actually have the power he thinks he has. And that is, as you say, sort of the arc of that sequence, which culminates with they're in the main, like, room of that mansion where they're going to have the big action scene. And the Merovingian storms in through the door, and his reaction there is so goddamn funny. Of like, but this Persephone, how could you do this to me? Like, it's so, he's so over the top, just goes into full, like, cartoon, almost like fucking Pepe Le Pew mode.
Yeah, or it's like, it's very like Inspector Clouseau to me in that scene of just like the stumbling over his own fake French accent. Yeah.
It's so great. Yeah, it's a really, I mean, it is, all told, probably the most idiosyncratic stretch of the entire Matrix trilogy is the, like, 15 minutes here with the Merovingian and the orgasmic chocolate cake, and I mean, there's just so much here that is fascinating to me. The big kiss scene with Persephone, who makes Neo, like, show him love, and obviously there's this whole, like, Hades, Persephone, like, you know, love story in the underworld thing going on here. But I love it. It is very much, it is the Wachowskis just completely unbound from anyone telling them no, and in the best way possible.
Yeah, and like I said, like, I think it is like, if you're going to do this whole play on do we or do we not have free will, I think, like, the question is, like, so inherently farcical that you have to have this. Like, you have to have, it's so, like, the question itself is so kind of pointlessly navel-gazing in a way that the movie's very aware of, that, like, having this as the way that you express it dramatically in a movie, I think is so perfectly on the nose. The performances, the way it's shot, all that stuff is just calibrated, I think, like, absolutely to the right level of silliness that it's going for.
Yes, I love it. I love the Merovingian. We'll see a little bit more of him in the third movie, and apparently, I forget if this is, like, still true, but at some point it was reported that Lambert Wilson, who plays the Merovingian, is one of the few returning actors in the new movies. Yes, he is still confirmed to be in Matrix Resurrections. I'm fascinated by that. I would like to see more of him, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I hope he forces more people to have orgasms with his weird cake that he I love he describes it as he wrote it himself, because it's actually a program.
Yes.
It's very good.
I mean, I think the shot that goes in, the woman, like, crosses her legs, we go in through, like, her crotch, but now into the digital world, and we see the, like, code explosion in her, like, genitalia region, like, in her vagina of the orgasm, is, like, a fascinating, funny, amazing, like that is something that I will say, like, film studies, like academic film studies, is very interested in, is, like, how do movies represent digital processes? Like, how do you filmically represent like what a computer is doing. So like the Matrix itself is one of the original texts of this, in that the Matrix does like the code, like Reloaded opens with that big code sequence that becomes like a keyhole, that becomes like a gear, and then we eventually come out into a clock. That's the kind of scene that like film studies is very interested in. It's one of the reasons why Michael Mann's Black Hat is kind of a growing film studies favorite, because of what it does with dramatizing like hacking and like information processes in like virtual space, which is this kind of thing that you can't actually visualize because those digital processes don't have a visual component. And I think that the Wachowskis do it with a like digital orgasm. That is something that probably has not been studied enough in film studies, because I want the like academic fucking conference presentation on the digital orgasm in the Matrix.
Yeah, just breaking down that whole sequence frame by frame. It's like, and see
Yes.
here, now it like zooms in one frame closer into the digital pubis of the woman.
Because it's the most sexually like explicit, if you want to define explicit by like seeing the naughty bits. Like, it's the most explicit thing in the movie. It's just that it does it through digital representation.
Yeah, it is, and it's, you know, part of like the whole free will thing is, as you're saying, is that it is your response to stimuli, right? Like, which is like, in many ways, almost like the definition of life is like physical matter that responds to external stimuli is like what life is. And the like sort of farcical irony of the sequence, of course, is that he gives her the cake so that she has the orgasm, being like, I am toying with these humans. Look me show you this like cause and effect. The cause is some sort of external stimuli. The effect is what you regard as human behavior, which is a thing that you rationalize as being free will, but is actually just the effect of some external cause you may or may not be aware of. But of course, then the joke is that he then goes to the bathroom and has her suck his dick, right? Like that's where it goes, is that he is the exact same. He's no different. He's no more superior. And that is probably like, to me, the funniest part in the whole movie is where Persephone is like, it's like you have like that lipstick. He's like, lipstick? There's no lipstick on me. It's just like, yeah, well, she wasn't kissing your lips. Is such a like is a very. I definitely, when I saw that movie in the movie theater, I did not totally get what that line was saying and how like how graphic that suggestion is, and it's like Jesus, that is a raunchy joke.
I mean, as a kid, did you understand anything in this entire extended sequence? Did you understand what was going on with the cake? I think as a kid, I thought that was like a diarrhea thing going on or something, right? Like,
yeah, I definitely have that memory of responding like, is this a sex scene thing, or does she have to like go to the bathroom? Because he goes to the bathroom, but of course that is code for naughty things that one might do in the bathroom in a public place.
Yeah, but I didn't know what like. I guess, so 2003, I guess 5th grade was sex ed, but sex ed in America doesn't, like, teach you what an orgasm is. It just teaches you, like, the raw, like, scientific side
and it doesn't, you know, you don't think about all the, like, physical processes that might be involved in bringing someone to orgasm via the mouth, that then might have, like, how lipstick would be involved in that process.
Yeah, no, that definitely flew over my head.
But it's so fucking funny. Like that whole, just like, it's just the most like intentionally cliche, like man and wife spatting at each other stuff. But yeah, and this is one of those where like, this is a scene that I think like so many people just like completely, what the scene is doing just went over their heads, because this is one of those that like is broadly mocked in like, it's this and the rave scene, I think, are the two things in this movie that are specifically made fun of. And like, you know, I don't know how, you know, the rave scene, I think, is at some point might just be people's like discomfort with sex. This, I think, is just completely, people just didn't understand that the scene is being very funny, very much on purpose. And it is like supposed to be a joke.
And it's not that the movie is being subtle. Again, crazy cartoon French accent. The dude is, as you say, it's like, I mean, it's more than Inspector Clouseau. It's like Inspector Clouseau, very, very exaggerated, you know? And it's because it is a put on. Like, that's the other fun part of the scene, is that you're seeing this. The Merovingian is this program surrounded by programs who lives forever, who has, like, wants for nothing, has no real purpose to his existence other than, like, thinking he's above people, but because he's, like, lived forever and ensconced himself in humanity, he is completely slave to carnal desires. That's all he is. He is this completely carnal being. And I think that is a great little suggestion about, like, you know, there's so much, you know, in science fiction about, like, you know, what about, like, machines getting free will and, like, programs and AI becoming human? And I like that the Matrix's answer to that is him becoming human is him becoming kind of carnal and pathetic, you know?
Yeah, it's just he's like a parody of himself, of like what that person would be as a human. Yeah.
Right. Like, it makes sense that his French accent is stupid and unrealistic because he's a machine. He wouldn't have a French accent. It has to be a put-on. At some point in the Merovingian's existence, he had to choose to adopt a French accent, which is what's funny.
Yeah, I mean, as he says, like, he can speak all the languages, and French is his favorite because it sounds so good when you curse in it, which is the most, like, petty, like, thing to possibly define your entire, like, verbal identity around.
Yeah, no, I love all of this, and I agree. I think this and the rave are maybe the two most maligned, and, well, the architect scene, too. The architect scene also.
Sure, yeah.
And those are the three maybe most interesting parts of the whole movie. So...
Yes. Yeah, I think without a doubt, those are the three best things in the whole film. Yeah.
So what happens after this, I think, is it sounds like maybe the other part of the movie you and I have disagreements on, because this is where we get our big sort of half hour of action. You have Neo in the mansion, the big sort of kung fu fight scene with all of the Merovingian's programs. I really like that scene. I think that's just good old-fashioned Matrix fun.
Yeah, that scene I think is quite good, because it feels very immediately motivated, because part of it is just like showing up the Merovingian, right, and exposing him for like the ridiculous fraud that he is, and you know, like, Neo can easily dispatch of all these just like random goons. There's, you know, he gets to fight with some Psy like he's fucking a Ninja Turtle. It's a good time.
It's good. It's you know, some of this movie just also needs to play with that Neo has superpowers. Mm-hmm. So we just need a couple of scenes where he does superpower shit. And here it's superpowered, but still it's like he's leveled up from the fight with Smith in the first movie, and he can do it with all these fucking guys, and it's really good. I think this is something the Matrix movies do that Hong Kong, like, action movies and kung fu movies do, but American movies don't do enough, which is just build a set to destroy it.
Yes.
They do it here, they do it even with the Seraph scene. They don't destroy it, but that set is purely built for the fight. This set, the big lobby in the first Matrix movie, and then this set here is this big, cool set that they build entirely for the functionality of having a big, cool fight sequence and fucking that space up. And I love it because they fuck it up good. You get a lot of good Neo being the one. It's just a great action scene, and the music there. I love the music throughout the Matrix Reloaded. I think it levels up even from what the first movie did. And there's just some really cool, iconic pieces of music in here, and I love the one in this stretch.
Yeah, it's just a really well choreographed, really well paced, well conceptualized fight scene, and yes, it has a banger fucking song behind it.
Now, after that is the big highway chase, or the freeway. Let's just say the freeway, because you're not supposed to go on the freeway in the Matrix because it's suicide. I love the freeway chase, unmitigated. I think it's a 10 out of 10 action scene. I love it. You are more mixed on it?
In the abstract, I think it's an amazing action scene. When you say watch the action scene on YouTube, removed from the context of the rest of the movie, it's extremely impressive. I think in like the dramatic placement it has in the film, it's a very impressive sequence that to me is just like there's so little motivation behind it, right? It's not, our main character is not involved in the scene at all, right? Like in Trinity and Morpheus are important supporting characters, and they are like interesting, and they do need to have some amount of like time dedicated to them in the film. But I think like the amount of time that is dedicated to this scene for them is like very outsized. Like it is a long action scene for the main character to be totally absent from. And the like objective of the action scene is so abstract at this point of like, we gotta protect the key maker because he's the guy who gives us the key that gets us to the thing that we're trying to get to. And this is where like the like sort of breadcrumb plotting of this kind of middle section of the movie, where I think it works for me in the Merovingian scene because of the farcical element of it, I don't think it's like strong enough to sort of serve as the spine for this big action sequence. In the way that, like, if you look at the first movie, when you have the equivalent, like, really big action scenes in that movie, it's all motivated by their desire to go get Morpheus back. That's like a really strong, heavily motivated spine to those sequences that make them feel really important and super motivated in the drama of the movie and its plotting. And here, it's like, it feels like it only happens because, like, they want to have an action scene here, not because there's some sort of, like, really strong conflict that is being brought up in the plot that then necessitates a big action scene to try to resolve it, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes total sense. I can't disagree with any of that. I just don't care. Not that I don't care about your thoughts.
Yes.
I just don't necessarily care about that being a problem because, look, I think I am more partial to car chases than you are. I think we've learned this over many years of the podcast. Yes. And just, in general, I find it such a truly, like, virtuosic action fucking symphony at this point. Like, all of the moving pieces going on. I think it is like, it's like a great silent movie. I mean, it's got music and all of that is really good, but it reminds me of, like, some of this, like, the pure kineticism of, like, a silent comedy or some big action sequences in Jackie Chan movies where, yes, I think as you, and I think the point you made earlier, maybe a bit talking about, like, Flashpoint and stuff like that, is the motivation matters a little less in something like that.
And also, they are motivated, like, because they're very simple stories. Like, it's, here's a bad guy, I want to go beat up the bad guy, is a much more straightforward motivation than there's this character that we just met that seems to be able to serve a function that will get us to a thing that we need to get because a lady very cryptically told us about it in a speech where she also told us that we don't have free will, is not a good, strong motivation for, like, a 30-minute action scene.
And I understand what you're saying there. But I think the filmmaking of it, the kineticism of it, the number of moving pieces that are moving in harmony, the amount of, like, things that happen in motion, I'm fascinated by it. I think it is like it's just something that completely sweeps me away. I love it every time. When Neo grabs them from the explosion at the end, I want to stand up and cheer the way Harold Perrineau does behind the screen watching it on the code. It works for me. It works for me 100%. I think it's so full of good moments. I like having a scene focused on Morpheus and Trinity. I kind of like this idea in, like, the world of the Matrix throwing, because the thing of why Neo can't be in this scene is Neo would just end the scene. Like, he can't come in until the end because nothing in this scene would be hard for him because he could just pick up all three of them and fly away. And I like the idea that Morpheus and Trinity are stranded on their own and they are doing a bunch of stuff that you're not supposed to do in the Matrix. You're not supposed to fight the agents. You're not supposed to go on the freeway because the agents can do all this shit on the freeway. They've got the agents coming after them. They've got the two ghost people coming after them. And I love, like, how high the deck is stacked against them and how many ways you find in, like, almost to, like, a Buster Keaton-esque degree of the number, and then, or like Jackie Chan being, like, the modern equivalent of just shit that is thrown at them over the course of the sequence is very fun. And it also has a scene where Morpheus stands down a big car and he cuts, like, a big piece off of it with a katana and then uses that opening to shoot it with an Uzi and make it blow up and kill the two ghosts. And I'm just a human being. I can't resist that. It's too fucking good. Lawrence Fishburne looks too good in that black leather jacket and green tie with a fucking katana. It's looking a gift horse in the mouth to not love that.
I mean, I like that sequence a lot. The problem is that, like, that it feels like a scene that is from, like, the hypothetical Matrix 2 Here We Go Again, right? It is like it's the reason I think why this is the scene that, like, whatever people say about the Matrix Reloaded, this is the scene that people really like. And it makes sense because it's like, this is the sequence that most feels like a scene from the first movie, because it's not dealing with the specific, like, thematic concerns of the Matrix Reloaded. It's not interested in exploring the more, like, kind of heightened superpower element that the other action sequences in this movie have, because Neo's not involved. And so it is the most, like, let's do a scene that, like, we couldn't do for the first movie because it would have been too fucking crazy in terms of, like, the scale. It's only because we have the buy-in from that first movie being so successful we can even attempt something like this. And let's go for it. The problem is that it's just, like, in a movie that otherwise is very heady and is very concerned with a lot, like, of big thematic ideas, this sequence feels totally out of place regardless of how well it's done. And I think it is incredibly well done. And I think the other problem that then the movie runs into is that after you have this, you then have the whole ending sequence, which is composed of things that are like could be much more easily reframed as like big action set pieces that are much more heavily motivated in character. That then the ending sequence of the movie is presented in this very kind of like compressed, fragmented way, when it's like we just spent 30 minutes in this giant freeway action scene that was very cool, but doesn't feel like it sort of like does anything really immediate or necessary for the story that's being told in this film.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't disagree with your analysis because I think you're right. It works for me, so I don't know what else to say. I don't have that same issue with it, even though I think I definitely have had that issue with like other movies and other times. I think I'm just impressed with it enough that it works for me. I also love the lore around it. They built an entire 1.5 mile freeway for this. This was not shot on an actual freeway. They built it on old runways at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, because they could not find an actual stretch of freeway that would allow them to do this. That is one of the most like crazy flexes I've ever heard of in making a big like Hollywood movie.
Yeah. I think my favorite moment in this whole sequence is actually before all of it starts, where they're going down that hallway and Morpheus just stops and grabs a fucking like katana that is just like just sitting there on like this piece of armor in like where the fuck they are at that point, because they're going through all like the doors that take them to different places. And I love that he's just like, you know what I'm gonna need? I'm gonna need this fucking samurai sword. It's like, I know we've got a bunch of guns and shit, but I'm gonna stop here. It's like, this is gonna come in fucking handy eventually. I tell you what.
But that's what I mean about how good the sequence is, because you have this katana, and it does feel like a prop in a Jackie Chan movie, in that it is used in so many ways over the course of this like extended action sequence of he does the thing with the car, he stabs the ghost out of the car when they're all fighting in the little car that Trinity is driving. Then he's using it to like swing himself up on the truck when he fights the agent. Then he falls off it, gets the sword back, does the thing with the agent again. Like, I love that they like give him a katana and then they fucking use it in so many cool ways, in like creative, filmic, kinetic ways over the course of the sequence.
Yeah, that stuff's really well done.
Yeah. What's funny is that neither of us are disagreeing with what any of the other are saying. It's just like a matter of degrees here, I think, of like what side of it weighs us down more or builds us up more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I just think like it's just something where like in the context of the rest of the movie, I just really needed it to have more like sense of like meaning to it than it had. And it almost kind of reminds me a little bit like this. It's a slightly different thing. But I had a similar feeling at like the end of Rogue One, where there's so many people who really love the big action climax of that movie, and I felt totally alienated by it because half of the action climax of Rogue One is completely absent of any of the characters in that film, and like those sequences only exist to increase the scale of the action. This is like not exactly that same thing, but I had a similar feeling of alienation from the action because it felt so removed from like any of the other things that the movie was doing that it felt like the thing that you get in a Mission Impossible movie where the action scenes are conceptualized before like the story of the movie is conceptualized, but a Mission Impossible movie is just an action movie and that's kind of it, and The Matrix Reloaded isn't that, so that same kind of feeling or approach just doesn't really work for me.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I was looking up some of those production details. Here's another fun fact. Around 97% of the materials used to make sets in this movie were recycled, including tons of wood that were sent to Mexico to build low-income housing.
Nice.
That's nice. That's more... I don't know if that's a standard thing movies do. I mean, movies don't build sets anymore. It's one of the things that sucks about modern movies. But if they do build sets again, that's a good thing to do. I like that idea.
What do you think they did with that katana? They just, like, send it to some random person that's like, you could use this, you know, it's a bit big to use as, like, a kitchen knife, but, hey, you could give it a shot.
Man, if I were Lawrence Fishburne, I would have a house with a long hallway with, like, all my costumes and props and all the cool shit I've worn in movies, because, man, Lawrence Fishburne is just a cool motherfucker. I love him.
Yeah, I would just have, like, a big, you know, box that, you know, people have, like, to keep their, like, jewelry in. I would have that, but it was just all the sunglasses I wore across the three Matrix movies.
If you're Lawrence Fishburne, how do you not just, like, show up, like, every time someone comes over to your house in the sunglasses, sitting in, like, a red leather chair with a fucking long trench coat, you know?
Yes.
With a red pill and a blue pill out on a table. I think a fun little visual callback, the scene that they're in during the big, you kind of mentioned this earlier, the big sort of interconnected montage where they show all of the build up to them getting to the architect through this like fragmentary like montage structure. The little room that they're in, I think, is supposed to be the room where he like gives Neo the speech in the first movie, because he's in that same chair when he's telling them about like the purpose of our lives leads to tonight, that whole thing.
Yes, I think like Morpheus is like, this will be very poetic, guys. Let's go back to that. You know, hey Neo, you know that place we had that talk? Let's go back there before we go fuck this shit up.
Morpheus would absolutely have a sense of like poetic full circledness.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about this last stretch of the movie. I understand there's definitely, you could do more of some of that action as like a fully articulated action sequence. I've always found the construction of that montage where they're like laying out the plan and we see all of the pieces of it happening a little out of order. I find that a very like compelling piece of filmic construction, and also like incredibly well put together on an editorial level. Has always been very striking to me.
Yeah, I do think I like it as it exists. It just kind of confuses me that the movie spent so much time and energy on this like big action scene that really doesn't need to exist. When you then present a big action scene immediately afterwards, it's like, well, this is like feels really motivated by the plot, and it involves all the characters in this like complex way. And it feels like you could have fleshed that out a little bit more. This is also where, and this does not actually bother me, but I guess I could note is that this is also where the last level Into the Matrix is, right? Is like Niobe's whole side of it, where it's like Niobe's here is like, I'm going to go off to my video game, I'm going to go beat the video game over here, then you guys go over to that one and you'll all die, and then Neo and Morpheus, you do the real shit. It, like, I don't think it actually matters for the movie. Like, I don't think it's not a thing where like I'm sitting there waiting with bated breath to see a giant action set piece with Niobe in it. But it is something to like note that that's kind of where they put this.
Yeah, I've heard that complaint from some people that like, oh, the problem with Matrix Reloaded is that there's all that stuff in Enter the Matrix you have to get to understand this movie. That's not true. Like, I've seen people complain about the moment where Niobe rescues Morpheus with the car. That moment would exist without the game. Like, that's a totally common thing to do in an action movie, because it's a deus ex machina, but a very motivated one, because we know the movie does give you Niobe is on her way to like figure this shit out.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be a fun surprise in the movie if they did the director's cut where we intercut gameplay from Enter the Matrix of her driving to save Morpheus. Like, the game is a fun bonus. It is not a, like, because I've also seen academic analyses of like, the Matrix is an example of modern intertextuality, because to understand it you have to play a game and watch an anime and watch the movie, and that's not true. It's not true.
Yeah, like, because it doesn't, if you didn't know that video game existed, like none of that would stand out to you. Like, I think you might be a little bit like raise your eyebrows at how fragmentary this like ending sequence is presented, but the ending sequence is presented that way not because the Enter the Matrix exists. Like, that's because I don't think they wouldn't have focused on the Niobe stuff as much anyways. It's something that I don't think in any way is a problem with the movie. And as you say, I think it feels to me like they came up with the plot for Matrix Reloaded. Then they were like, okay, we can also do this video game thing. They had like a minor character in the plot of the Matrix Reloaded that they bumped up a little bit more. And then they're like, and then there's like some spaces for that character to do something that then does not affect the main plot of the movie at all, because Enter the Matrix's story is entirely like a fucking filler Dragon Ball movie or some shit, right? If like none of it ever happened, none of it ever matters, like no big lore is revealed, there's no huge surprises, nothing of any significance happens, nobody turns Super Saiyan 7 or whatever, it's just like a very whatever story that if it didn't exist, nobody would even notice.
Well, now I'm sad. In Matrix, Neo never goes Super Saiyan 7.
Yeah. He skips right to Super Saiyan 10.
All right. Do you think we'll get there eventually with Dragon Ball, Sean?
I mean, they stopped numbering it forever ago.
That's true. That's true.
At this point,
what would we be at now? If we went to 3, and then we have God, and we have Blue, and we have, I guess, Ultra Instinct, would that count? That would be 6?
Yeah, the 6, or maybe 7 if you split Ultra Instinct into 2.
Super Saiyan 4 was in there somewhere. It's just like that's
non-canon. Like, that doesn't coexist with Super Saiyan God. So Super Saiyan God is like the new Super Saiyan 4.
All right. Anywho, we're getting off track here.
This is the wrong time to talk about Dragon Ball in relation to the fucking Matrix. We need to save that for the next movie.
That's very, very true. All you people saying you want a live-action Dragon Ball movie, we got it. It's called The Matrix Revolutions, and no one's going to do better than that. Anyway,
Yep.
let's move, because we've seen people try. All right, you want to talk about the architect, Sean?
Yes, let's talk about Colonel Sanders.
Sean, I'm sending you in the chat a link to a transcript of the architect scene, because I think it might be helpful to have the full dialogue in front of you.
Yes, it is very dense. I did like watch the scene, and then I went back and I turned subtitles on to watch it again, because that man talks very quickly. It's like I want to like sit here and like actually really try to absorb everything that he's saying, and not just like the main ideas, because there's a lot of stuff going on here.
A lot of stuff going on here. What I love about... So this is this website where I found a transcript. leesmovieinfo.net. This is the most 2003 webpage I've ever seen.
Yes.
And one of the things I love is that because he uses a bunch of big words, there are like hyperlinked definitions of some of the words, like ergo, concordantly, pertinent, inexorably. Mm-hmm. That's really funny. Anyway, Sean... I have a lot of thoughts about the architect scene, but people know some of them. Let's start with you. What do you think about the architect scene?
I love it. I think it's... I think you kind of like already suggested a lot of the stuff that I love about it, but like it serves as like such a fascinating contrast to the rave scene, which, as you say, like are like kind of almost like symmetrical points in the movie. Where the architect is not quite right at the end. We got a little bit after this, and the rave scene is not quite at the beginning. You've got a little bit of setup before it. And it is this sort of just like flat, dry, here it is, straight from the word of God, or from the mouth of God, basically, the explanation of what the one is. And it's where, like, you get, we haven't talked much about, like, the Marxist-y kind of stuff in The Matrix, because it's not super heavy for a lot of The Matrix Reloaded, but I do think it's, like, very prevalent here, of the architect talking about that this is not the first Matrix, right? It's the sixth, which in my memory, it was always, like, some, like, inconceivably large number. I didn't realize it's, like, there haven't been that many Matrixes, because this is a very common plot device at this point that was not as common back then, but we really like... particularly like video games do this all the fucking time.
Like Mass Effect?
Yes, Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, Halo. Like once you get to Halo 4 starts doing this. Like the big cyclical like movements of history and all that kind of stuff, and the revelation of like this is not the first time that this has happened. Anime loves the shit out of this, which is probably
Gundam.
Yeah, like this is probably, I'm going to guess there's some anime, I don't know what it specifically was, but almost certainly was the specific influence for this with the Wachowskis, because it is a super common plot device in anime and anime adjacent media. It's like every visual novel since like 1992 or some shit has had some version of like, it's all actually like you replaying the game over and over and go through routes happens in some sort of like metatextual sense that there actually are like cycles or some shit. So it's that kind of thing. It's a hilariously small number for cycles, because I usually think of it as like it's an infinite number. Like who knows how many matrices it's been. It has been 6 matrices. He's the 6th one. And every time they go through this cycle, it exists basically to kind of like incorporate the elements that are created within the system through, the problem of human choices, they describe it, but whatever like dissident factions that will exist inevitably within the system, and to reincorporate and integrate those things back into the system, and therefore making the system better. And it will never be perfect. There will always be another one. The cycle will always continue, because the problem of human choice will always exist. But it feels like this big way of dramatizing this phenomena that, like, in Marxist criticism is very real, of that capitalism incorporates the things that are produced within the culture to try to tear down capitalism. And it reincorporates those things into the capitalistic structure, and thus makes it even more robust. Like, and good examples of that phenomena are like the Matrix in and of itself as a piece of very capitaled media. It is something that you buy. It is made through the process of capital. It is sold, right? Like the profits from the Matrix films primarily go to like billionaires at these fucking movie studios and that kind of stuff. So the Matrix, while it is a product that culturally is motivated against capitalism, is giving you messages against capitalism, is itself integrated and incorporated into the mechanisms of capitalism to make itself even more fierce. Because any thought that exists to defy the capital structures are actually just produced by the capital structures so that it can be controlled. And this is like the kind of cycle that is being taken and dramatized here through like the prophecy of the One and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it also makes me think of like fucking Twitter brands trying to be woke or stuff like that.
Yes.
Like, you know, when all the Twitter brands want to tweet about pride, and it's like, you know what? Part of the point of pride is tearing you the fuck down. Like,
yes,
you know,
it's the
shut
way.
up.
Yeah, that's a very good thing of observation of like it's the way that like progressive or radical left like political language and stuff like that, like being woke and all that shit, is slowly sort of like watered down and reincorporated into broader political speech that then strips it of all of its like original meaning and turns it into something that is very quaint and non-threatening, and that can make people feel like they're being cool or woke or radical or whatever, but in fact you're just like further reinforcing and pushing yourself deeper into like the control of the system that you are a part of.
Yes, because the way they describe it, and this is something that I want to get into, is that people still have this weird feeling that like the Matrix didn't explain enough. This scene explains everything you could possibly want to ask about the lore of the Matrix. It gives it to you surgically, like a fucking textbook. And part of that is he lays out what we heard in the first movie, which is that Matrix 1.0 was a utopia. It was too perfect. And then it broke down. Matrix 2.0, it sounds like from the architect, went too far in the other direction and like was trying to control too much. And that is when the Oracle comes in and he says, like, if I am the father of the Matrix, she, it must be said, is its mother. Oh, that whole thing. And the mother of the Matrix, the Oracle, says you have to allow them, even if it is completely subconscious, some element of choice. They have to be aware that the reality is wrong. And so it is coded into the Matrix. Everything we saw in that first movie of Neo sort of waking up and realizing the Matrix has you and all of that, that is an allowance of the machines because they have to have people have that choice at least a little bit, or else they will not accept their own enslavement, basically. And then over time, enough people come to accept that and realize it, that there is a actual danger to the system because enough people will start to rebel and try to break out. And if that is the case, then you create the One who will be the prophecy that everyone will flock to. That will be the thing that people will build their rebellion around. The One will return to the source. This is the 6th time it's happened. He comes to the source, and then at the source is told Zion will be destroyed. The only way you can save humanity is to basically reset the Matrix, and in so doing reset humanity. He says you will choose 13 females and 7 males and all of this. And that is the whole process. And it is like, one, I think a very cool lore dump. There is something, I think, metatextual going on here about the audience's desire for answers. And then, as you say, Sean, it is this really smart, like, very applicable model of capitalism in the fiction of the Matrix that, like, really kind of hits the nail on the head of how these systems work. By doing it through this, like, cold computer structure, it actually makes it even easier, I think, to understand the Marxist critique.
Yeah, and that, like, the fact that you know it doesn't mean that you can do anything about it is part of the thing as well, right? That, like, the architect sits here and tells Neo all of this, knowing that whether or not Neo is even aware of all these things doesn't matter, because, you know, he's going to, I mean, part of it is like the free will thing. Neo's going to make the choice he's going to make no matter what. Like the input that the architect can give is not enough to, like, overwhelm the emotional input of Trinity's impending death. But also that it's like our knowledge of the ways that these systems work so far has not stunted the ways that the systems have functioned, right? Because Marxist thought and Marxist criticism and Marxist analysis is in of it itself has been integrated and incorporated into, like, the systems of capitalism, right? Because the way that I learned about Marxism was at a public institution that I went to and I paid money to attend, right? And that, like, institution makes profit by exploiting the people that work at it. It's like it's kind of like this terrifying thing about the system of capitalism is that it is, like, feels utterly inescapable when you are in the midst of it, because anything you try to do to escape it, and historically so far has been done to try to escape it, is just reincorporated. And there's something about just like the cold, flat, just here it is, and there's nothing you can do about it, nature of what the architect is saying, that I find very compelling.
Absolutely. And I think paired with that then, and this is where I think The Matrix as an entity, as a series, whatever, is always at its richest, is when these things can be multivalent. We talked about this a lot in the last episode, right, Sean? Mm-hmm. And I think this is one where it is this big Marxist critique that is a really, really powerful presentation of it that kind of recolors the whole trilogy for you because it is this pivotal scene. But I think it is also a really great scene about storytelling and like what audience expectations are. Because so I wrote this last night. I think at some point I should probably develop an actual like thesis on this at some point. But I think the architect scene sort of both anticipates and in its anticipation refutes our like brain dead cinema sins generation by giving the viewer all the answers. And as we said, it's clean and plain. It's cold, unfeeling logic. It just tells you. This is like, it could not be more plain and clear. It's dense, but it's not like subtle or anything like that, right?
Yeah, it's basically like he just is reading like the synopsis from the fucking fan wiki to you is more or less what he's doing.
Yes. So it gives you all the answers, and in giving you all the answers, it also tells you it doesn't fucking matter, because to acquiesce to the system of answers is to surrender your own humanity at the door and not have any choice or will in it, right? And like knowing all of it doesn't actually change, in the Marxist critique, doesn't change that the system exists. The knowing is not the thing that tears down the system, you know? Mm-hmm. But then also I think in the storytelling side of it, getting like this scene is on paper what everyone who ever complained about the ending of Lost, every one of those fucking CinemaSins videos that doesn't know how movies work, any of those like modern critiques of like the story didn't make sense because there was this thing and then they didn't explain the thing.
The entire cottage market on YouTube of people like with those awful thumbnails of like the ending of Dune explained.
Exactly.
It's like it wasn't a confusing movie, but there's like then you look at that movie, that video has like 8 million views or some shit.
No, it's one of the most popular things. Yeah, that is the one that drives me fucking crazy now, is the ending of X explained. I saw that for fucking the new James Bond movie, which I won't spoil it, but if you've seen the new James Bond movie, there's nothing subtle or like that needs to be explained about the end of that movie, because the thing that happens is very absolute. Like, and it's just everywhere is that shit. And
the ending of King Kong explained. It was beauty that killed the beast in the video.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, you see, when a monkey falls from a high enough height, the trauma of the impact will kill it. Yeah, like basically the architect scene is exactly what every one of those critiques is asking for. It is the scene where someone sits you down and holds your hand and calmly and clearly talks you through everything. And I think what is revelatory about the scene, and what is like, and I think gets more interesting about it with every fucking passing year, is that the whole point of the scene is that getting all the answers doesn't really matter. It isn't actually significant. It's what Neo then goes and does that matters, because of the door he chooses and the revolution that comes after that. The actual like sitting down and being explained everything, it is alienating. Like the scene is startling to a certain degree because it is so sort of alien and cold and weird, and it's often been made fun of and like, oh, it's dense and confusing and blah, 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 blah. But like, that's the whole point, is that it is weird in a story to get to the point where God sits you down and tells you his entire plan. Because in doing that, you realize how insignificant you are. And I think that is one of the brilliant things about The Matrix Reloaded. It is really prophetic about where media criticism was going to go in the 20 years after its production.
Yeah, and it's also just like, it resonates so much with the rest of the themes of the movie, of like that sense of free will, is that like, if you are, whether or not you are aware of you having free will, like again, it's that thing of like, it's pointless. Like the answer to the question, do you have free will or not, is not a productive answer. There's no way to give a productive answer to that question, actually, because if you don't have free will, then the question had no point in the first place, right? The question itself was just a product of you having no free will and you have no ability to express any authority or power behind it. And this is kind of the same thing. It's like getting the answers to these kinds of questions don't really matter. What matters is the thing that you saw at the beginning of the movie, right? What matters is that like human connection. What matters is like that feeling, that emotion, that thing that gives you that sense of purpose through human connection and emotion and happiness and joy. Like that's the stuff that matters. It's not Colonel Sanders in a white room telling you the way that the world works, because the way that the world works is a thing that can be explained to people. It's not like so incredibly complicated and sophisticated that like the average person can't understand it after like a 10-minute long conversation about that kind of shit. It's like you can get it. It makes sense. But it doesn't matter. Like it shouldn't change the way that you live your life necessarily, because you don't have the ability to fucking destroy the architect or rip down this system just by going through that one door or the other door.
Yeah. It's, I'm looking at some of my notes from when I wrote about this in January. And one of the things I said is that the movie kind of neuters all possible lore questions, where I think fans have a lot of unhealthy relationships. I think is one way to say that in a calm way, is that there's a lot of unhealthy relationships online with lore. And it neuters that by just giving you all the answers, which leaves you with no choice but to consider the actual themes on display, right? The actual meat of the story. And, it also, and I think it is kind of the masterstroke of the entire trilogy in like a structural sense, is it's the midpoint of the story is where it gives you all of the answers, and then Neo has to say, well, I'm not ready for the story to end, right? He has to say, well, I'm not going to play by the script anymore, because the script, what he's supposed to do is go through the left door and reset the Matrix, and that's the end. But he doesn't. He says, I'm not ready for it to end, and he goes through the other door to a more contingent future, and to a more revolutionary future, as the next movie is going to say. And that is kind of, especially now you go back to like the Marxist critique, that's the whole point, is that like knowing what the system is one side of it. It's then, that's the first time when Neo walks through the wrong door, that's the first time he's not actually playing by the system that has been laid out and not following that script. And that is what opens up the next movie. And we get a little preview of it at the end here, that now he has completely unanticipated powers in stopping the Sentinels in the real world and all these barriers breaking down, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course that being like the extension of like a lot of the like philosophical, the Buddhist-y kind of stuff that is not as much a part of a lot of this movie, in the sense of like him seeing the code as this like shorthand for nirvana, right? And like revelation, and it being here, this thing that now breaks into what we understand in the context of the movie being actual reality, and him seeming to have achieved some version of that in the real world, is like pushing that up to this other layer where all of his revelation, his nirvana, all that stuff was just incorporated into the system. It wasn't really real. Now he has to try to make it actually real by breaking out of like the system and not being a part of the Matrix.
Right. Yeah, and it is bringing up all sorts of thorny questions, as we said, and you all can be the judge of whether you think the third movie follows up on this satisfactorily. But I do think like this is the movie, actually paying off the big questions it's laying down, is with a scene that is pretty stylistically and narratively radical in how just plain and clear it is, and in saying that this thing that is usually the goal, or is not usually the goal, but is often the goal of storytelling and is often the thing that modern audiences want, is not the point and is not the salvation that you think it is. Like, Morpheus was wrong. The one, the chosen one thing isn't real. Or that if it is real, who's doing the choosing really fucking matters if there's a chosen one, right?
Yeah.
And if the person doing the choosing is the person in part of the system, or in control of the system, and you want to dismantle the system, then the chosen one isn't going to be the thing that's going to save you, at least in that sense. And I think all of that is just beautiful and fascinating and wonderful. And it's just every time I watch it, I find that more sort of invigorating and interesting, especially because, then I go on Twitter and I see another fucking... The ending of Halloween Kills explained. Michael Myers killed everyone. He stabs them with a knife. It's not ambiguous. No Halloween movie is ambiguous. He takes a big knife and he stabs people and they die. You don't need to explain it. For the love of God. Like, but for some reason we want to do that, and you know what? If the next Halloween movie wants to do a scene with the fucking architect sitting Michael Myers down and telling him why he kills people, I will stand up and applaud in the audience because it'll be funny.
Yeah, it's a thing of where the way this scene is handled is one of the main things that shuts down the notion of like the Infinite Matrix franchise, right? Because it's like once you've had, you know, Colonel Sanders read you the Wikipedia entry on what the Matrix is, like it shuts down the like, oh, we can tell a story in this corner of the universe and in this corner of the universe because the universe is explained, or like the Matrix part of the universe is explained and is explicable within the bounds of the movie. So it's like there's not the infinite imagination space to do the expanded universe Matrix novels because they would all feel so pointless, because it's just like, well, what's the point of telling another story in this setting when all the rest of what like the purpose that the universe serves is like how has already been told in this other story. It's not equivalent to a Star Wars where, you know, Star Wars exists in a random universe that has no purpose and you can tell whatever stories you want because it's just a cool world that has cool history and cool like art. It evokes a lot of things with like the style and culture that they created for that fictional setting. This is like this very contained boxed thing, and this is them like saying we're closing the lid on this box, we're going to give you that next movie, and then after that it's closed and it's done until, you know, we make one more movie like 20 years later and we'll find out what that one is. But this,
which like very well might not even be in the same continuity from what we're seeing. Like, you know, it could be a totally different thing.
Yeah, but this is like, to me, this is like the number one reason why you don't have the 1,000 Matrix like spin-off things that you would expect from a franchise that was this successful.
Yeah, like what would you do? Would you do the HBO Max series about like the fifth one and his journey, and like that would be the most boring shit in the world because you know he's just a pawn, right? Yeah.
Or it's my hit Netflix spin-off that's just called Ghost, and it's the adventures of Ghost, the guy that nobody played as of the two playable characters in Enter the Matrix. And let's just see what is he up to in the world. Like, what was he doing during the events of the original Matrix movie, I think is the question that everyone has really been asking about these films.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's great. But going back to what you said about Neo starting to like see the universe, I forgot there's one line in this movie from the Oracle conversation we forgot to mention that is the most Gundam thing ever said in a Hollywood movie, which is when the Oracle says to Neo, "You have the sight now, Neo. You are looking at the world without time."
Yes.
Fucking love that line. That made me sit up and go like, oh my God, she's like one step away from telling him you're gonna cry the tears of time.
Yes.
Anyway. So yeah, and then you do get the ending where, I mean, this is obviously a big preview of what's going to happen in Revolutions, but out in the real world, him seeing the code in reality and stopping the Sentinels, I think is such a cool fucking idea.
Yeah.
Man, it rocks.
I
love the way...
It's exactly what it needed to be. Like, it's that thing where it's just like, as soon as it happens, you're like, yes, this is what must happen. It's such a good conceptualized idea.
Yeah, because, and again, it is also paying off the idea that now that we have done the thing with the architect and Neo has gone through the wrong door, things will change, right? Mm-hmm. And that's also part of like one of the things that I just, and you know, maybe if there's other listeners who have not seen these movies in a while, I will warn you about Revolutions. And I think it was something that was off-putting to people at the time. It does not feel like the other Matrix movies. It's really different. It mostly doesn't happen in the Matrix. It is much grittier. It is much darker. And I think that is very necessary because once you've done the architect scene, you can't go do another big highway chase. You can't go do another like mansion kung fu fight sequence. The closest you can do is the Dragon Ball fight at the end, and even that's pretty different than what we've seen so far, right? Mm-hmm. You know, it really closes off certain avenues and makes you go in a new direction. And I think the Neo stopping the Sentinels and then falling into a coma is a good sort of encapsulation of a promise of that's where the story's going.
Yes, and then you get the real promise of where the story is going, because there was the one survivor of the Sentinel attacks, and it's Agent Smith. Bum bum bum. To be continued.
I think it's a pretty killer cliffhanger.
Yes, I love it. Just because I want to see more Agent Smith, because he's the fucking best, and there's not enough of him in this. I mean, there are a lot of him in this movie, but there's not enough of him in this movie.
Well, there's many more of him in the next movie, and yeah, I do like obviously all the stuff with Bane, who is the body that Smith is in, will be more prominent in the next movie, so I will save anything for that. But I do like all the little hints in this movie, like just the implication of Smith taking over this guy and then becoming his mind in the real world, and then he starts cutting his hand because he's like so fascinated in flesh, is just it's all a teaser for the next movie, but it's why the cliffhanger is so effective.
Yes.
Yeah. We didn't talk about Neo saving Trinity and massaging her heart back to life after taking the bullet out. I think that's a pretty cool fucking scene.
Yeah. Naruto did it better, but it's pretty well done.
How does Naruto do it?
Well, Naruto himself doesn't do it. Sakura does it to Naruto. But yeah, there is a sequence in Naruto where Sakura physically beats his heart because Naruto's going to die, and she keeps him alive by opening up his chest and putting her hand in there and pumping his heart with her fucking hand because Naruto is sick.
Nice. I mean, that's just doctors do that sometimes too.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. But this is a ninja doing it, Jonathan.
Okay, that's true. Sakura and Naruto aren't in love though, right?
No, Naruto had a crush on Sakura, but it went unrequited, and that character dynamic is very well executed.
Right.
On.
Yeah. Anyway, I need to watch Naruto sometime when we do Weekly Suit Naruto, one episode at a time. We'll spend an entire year and a half on filler. More than a year and a half.
I haven't even seen any of the filler, so that would be a new experience for me.
All right. Yeah, but I think that's an interesting idea, and it's a big romantic ending. And it is another thing, though, that the movie is playing on, because the next movie does not have that ending. So, we'll see.
I do like when Neo, like, he makes his hand, like, incorporeal in the Matrix, and then, like, pulls the bullet out. The only problem I have with that is, like, the bullet's not made incorporeal, so when he's removing the bullet, presumably that would have just ripped through her fucking organs. But,
Well, maybe it's like his hand. He makes it incorporeal, and then, like, when it comes back out, it's corporeal again? I don't know. We don't see it, like, ripping through her organs.
Yeah. I think that it's, like, there's something about the way that is shot that it, like, because the bullet looks so much more physical, it's like, okay, I feel like that would be pulling some shit out if you just went in and grabbed it and pulled the bullet out. It's also a very good example of, like, the absolute nonsense movie shorthand of, like, oh, you've been shot with a bullet. Well, if we pull the bullet out, everything will be fine. It's not how gunshot wounds work.
No, but, like, yeah. I think what's interesting about that scene, and there's only so far they can go with it, because at a certain point this idea is hard to visualize. The point is that, like, Neo's powers have leveled up to the degree where this isn't a physical body he's fixing. He's fixing the code. Like, that's what he's doing. And I think that's a really... I mean, and again, that is one of those moments that is, like, very defining to, I think, who the Wachowskis are, is this, like, mix of, like, big romantic gesture with, like, really, like, heady technological stuff going on. You know
and like this weird kind of abstract symbolic representation of it. Because I want to make it very clear, I like that sequence. I'm cutely ribbing it. I don't actually care any about that shit because I think it's well done.
Yeah. No, it's great. And then you end with another Rage Against the Machine song that I was actually listening to right before we recorded. It's a good song.
I do think that, like, I like the Rage Against the Machine song. There's something about, like, this movie is so stylistically different that I do find, like, the going to the Rage Against the Machine song doesn't play as much as for me as the first movie does, because the ending of this movie is, like, very dark and upsetting, because it's like, because you come out of the Matrix into this, like, obviously we're already in, like, an apocalyptic setting, but the apocalypse within the apocalyptic setting, where you found out that the Sentinels have destroyed a bunch of their, like, ships, and everything's fucked up, and the Nebuchadnezzar's been destroyed, and now it's the Rage Against the Machine song is, like, a very different energy than, like, you can break free of the Matrix too. Now I'm gonna fly into the sky like Superman. Hit Rage Against the Machines.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. And yeah, the Nebuchadnezzar itself getting destroyed is sad. He has Morpheus says, "I have dreamed a dream, but now that dream is gone from me," which is the quote from the Bible, but it's from the historical Nebuchadnezzar, and I like that moment.
Yeah.
We also haven't talked about how fucking cool the ships are in the Matrix. I just realized, like, over these 2 episodes, I fucking love they're these, like, ships with these, like, magnetic sides that they're, like, sailing off of these, like, fucking metal pipes through the world. Mm-hmm. Those ships are just really cool.
Yeah, there's a real good, like, just everything's just, like, this harsh, like, corrugated fucking metal with big jagged edges on it and like big, thick fucking black cables everywhere. Like there's definitely this just like hard tech like cyberpunk aesthetic to the technology in
Yes.
Matrix that I really love. Like everything is so grimy and dirty and fucked up, and it really just looks like all the ships were just sort of glued together from random pieces of scrap and shit like that. It's,
Well, because like, and I love there's the scene. So there's the 3 ships that are together, as Morpheus tells us. You know, if there's 3 captains, 3 ships, 3 missions, this must be fate. And one of them gets destroyed because the guy is running across the little bridge, and the ship is just fucked up, and it falls and impales the other guy and sends blood all over the screen, just because the ships are gnarly and fucked up. That's a really good. This kind of, it becomes like a very Hitchcockian thing where he keeps running over the like broken part of the bridge, and you're waiting for it to blow. That's one of that montage. I think again is just so well constructed. But yeah.
Those ships are definitely an OSHA fucking nightmare for sure.
Yes, that's going to be the plot of the Matrix Resurrections. Is Neo is going to be the new OSHA administrator on the Nebuchadnezzar.
It's like you got to make sure that none of this metal comes to a sharp point. You're just asking for like an inconvenient impaling at some point.
All right. Anything else to say about the Matrix Reloaded?
I think I've enjoyed this conversation. I think this is like kind of summed up pretty well my feelings on it. Of like, I love all the ideas so much. There's a lot of stuff in the movie I love. Like for me, some of the action stuff I wish was like more conceptualized to be in line with a lot of the headier like themes and what those themes are saying. But it is still like all those criticisms are very much kind of grading on a scale because it is such an impressive, interesting, different, radical kind of sequel that is so much more interesting than just getting a Matrix 2. And I did have a very good time rewatching it, and I'm very excited to watch Matrix Revolutions and see sort of see where the story goes half with fresh eyes, because again, like half that movie I just don't remember what happened in it.
Yeah, I'm excited too, and this was a really fun and I think rewarding conversation that shows, if nothing else, there's a lot of rich ideas going on here, because we hit 3 hours and I didn't even notice. This kind of flew by.
Yes,
so.
I thought this was going to be a very short podcast because we didn't have a lot of stuff at the top of it, and no, this is a very normal sized podcast for us.
Next week, we'll talk about something. We're not sure yet. We'll figure it out. We'll let you know. But there will be more weekly stuff now that we're in the 400s. It's fucking hell.
Yeah, it's crazy. And at some point here, I need to crack into this fresh copy of Enter the Matrix now that I finally watched the movie. I need to know, what the fuck was Ghost up to that whole goddamn time?